Hey, over at ThomHartmann.com, we've got some really cool stuff. A lot of people don't realize that we produce a daily newsletter, and Sue puts we call it Sue's Daily Stack on there, which is literally a link to every story that I've talked about in the show. So all the research is right there. It's free. We don't share or sell our subscriber list. It's there's just it's there. It's there for you. And it's over at ThomHartmann.com. You can sign up for the free newsletter. You also can get my big picture take of the day, which is exclusively over at our website at ThomHartmann.com, as well as links to our videos, the book reports we typically do every day, all this stuff and more. It's all there at ThomHartmann.com. So check it out and sign up for our newsletter. I think you'll really enjoy it and appreciate it and find a lot of value there. We put a lot of work into this stuff. And you'll find it all right there on our website at ThomHartmann.com. And be sure to check out the newsletter and sign up for it. It's great. Hi, for our book club today, we're reading from Bernie Sanders' new book, Where We Go From Here, 2 Years in the Resistance. This is from the introduction. During my campaign for president in 2016, I stated over and over again that the future of our country was dependent upon our willingness to make a political revolution. I stressed that real change never occurs from the top down. It always happens from the bottom up. No real change in American history, not the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the gay rights movement, the environmental movement, or any other movement for social justice has ever succeeded without grassroots activism, without millions of people engaged in the struggle for justice. That's what I said when I ran for president. That's what I believe now. That's what I've been working to accomplish over the last several years. At a time of massive and growing income and wealth inequality, as our nation moves closer and closer to an oligarchic form of society, we need an unprecedented grassroots political movement to stand up to the greed of the billionaire class and the politicians they own. And the good news is we're making progress. People in every region of our country are standing up and fighting back against the most dishonest and reactionary president in the history of the republic. In state after state, they're also taking on establishment politicians who are more concerned about protecting their wealthy campaign contributors than they are with the needs of the middle class and the working people they're supposed to represent. We're making progress when millions of people in every state in the country take to the streets for the Women's March in opposition to Trump's reactionary agenda. We're making progress when an unprecedented grassroots movement elects a young African American as mayor of Birmingham, Alabama. We're making progress when tens of thousands of Americans turn out at rallies and town hall meetings to successfully oppose the Republican effort to throw 32 million people off health insurance. We're making progress when governors and local officials announce in response to student demands tuition-free public colleges and universities. We're making progress when over the past 2 years, hundreds of first-time candidates of every conceivable background run for school board, city council, state legislature, and Congress, and many of them win. The good news is that the American people are far more united than the media would like us to believe. They get it. They know that over the past 40 years, despite a huge increase in worker productivity, the middle class has continued to shrink while the very rich have become very much richer. They know that for the first time in the modern history of the United States, our kids will likely have a lower living standard than us. The bad news is that instead of going forward together, demagogues like Trump win elections by dividing us. The bad news is that too many of us are getting angry at the wrong people. I was not an immigrant picking strawberries it was not an immigrant picking strawberries at $8 an hour who destroyed the economy in 2008. It was the greed and illegal behavior of Wall Street. It was not transgender people who threw millions of workers out on the street as factories were shut down all across the country. It was profitable multinational corporations in search of cheap labor abroad. Our job, for the sake of our kids and grandchildren, is to bring our people together around a progressive agenda. Are the majority of people in our country deeply concerned about the grotesque level of income and wealth inequality that we are experiencing? You bet they are. Do they believe that our campaign finance system is corrupt and enables the rich to buy elections? Overwhelmingly, they do. Do they want to raise the minimum wage to a living wage and provide pay equity for women? Yes, they do. Do they think that the very rich and large corporations should pay more in taxes so that all of our kids can have free tuition at public universities and colleges? Yep. Do they believe that the United States should join every other major country and guarantee health care as a right? Yes, again. Do they believe climate change is real? You got to be kidding. Are they tired of the United States of America, the wealthiest country in the history of the world, falling apart at the seams with roads, bridges, water systems, wastewater plants, airports, rails, levees, and dams either failing or at risk of failing? Who isn't? Further, a majority of the American people want comprehensive immigration reform and a criminal justice system that is based on justice, not racism or mass incarceration. Today, what the American people want is not what they're getting. In fact, under Republican leadership in the House, Senate, and White House, they are getting exactly the opposite of what they want. The American people want a government that represents all of us. Instead, they're getting a government that represents the interests and extremist ideology of wealthy campaign contributors. They want environmental policies that combat climate change and pollution and that will allow our kids to live on a healthy and habitable planet. Instead, they're getting executive orders and legislation that push more fossil fuel production, more greenhouse gas emissions, and more pollution. They want a foreign policy that prioritizes peacemaking. Instead, they're getting increased military spending and growing hostility to our long-term democratic allies. They want a nation in which all people are treated with dignity and respect and where we continue our decades-long struggle to end discrimination based on race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, and nation of origin. Instead, they have a president who seeks to win political support by appealing to those very deep-seated prejudices. During the last several years, I've worked hard in Washington, but I've also traveled to 32 states in every region of our country. I've seen the beauty, strength, and courage of our people. I've also seen fear and despair. I've talked to people with life-threatening illnesses in West Virginia who worry about what will happen to them or their loved ones if they lose the health insurance that keeps them alive. I've talked to young immigrants, dreamers in Arizona who are frightened to death about losing their legal status and being deported from the only country they have ever known. I talked to a young single mom in Nevada worried about how she can raise her daughter on $10.45 an hour. I talked to retirees and older workers in Kansas who are outraged that as a result of congressional legislation, they could lose up to 60% of the pensions they paid into and were promised as deferred compensation for a lifetime of hard work. Bernie Sanders, where we go from here.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Good morning, everybody. How you doing? This is the Thom Hartmann Show. We are pleased that you're listening. I am Jeff. I am pleased and honored to be here. Now, yesterday was Walk and Chew Gum Day. And the reason was the following debated question. It's been posed by a bunch of people. Daily Beast, I think their headline was, a strategic question for Democrats, dig in to the Mueller report or move on. For people who haven't been listening to us the last couple mornings, have access to no internet, don't watch any TV, have never seen a newspaper in the last several days, the very quick fill-in is that over the last few days, we have seen the closing of the last 2-year investigation that offered its conclusions. We don't know exactly what those conclusions are. We know the top lines. The top lines were no provable charges on collusion, on coordination, on conspiracy between the Trump administration, the Trump campaign, and Russia. Also, strong evidence, indictable evidence, 37 indictments, in fact, of Russian interference on American elections, trying to help elect Donald Trump, the current president of the United States. And then a jump ball, a punt, pick your own sports analogy if you like sports analogies, on whether or not there was obstruction of justice. And the question then becomes, should opponents of the president dig in and continue to prioritize the release of that information? The other background being, happening just in the last 26 hours, Mitch McConnell blocking the previously unanimous vote by the House to release the full report, leaving us in the dark as to why Bob Mueller did not reach a conclusion on obstruction of justice, and leaving us in the dark about what else was in the report, leaving even James Comey to say, I am confused about the actions of Bob Mueller. Now, everybody has been very kind. I really appreciate it. People have said nice things, tweeted nice things. And if you want to call in, by the way, the call-in line is 202-808-99 It's 202-808-9925. You can also tweet us at Thom Hartmann. You can tweet at me at Jefferson D. Smith. And I'll try to get to those tweets, try to get to those calls. And part of the question is see, I believe in sort of the genius of and, not the tyranny of or. But the question that is still happening within the inside halls of Democratic strategy rooms is whether to fight hard on the Mueller investigation, whether to fight hard on getting the report out, or whether to address instead, or with a higher priority, what the Department of Justice did the very next day, which is say that the Trump administration will work to eliminate health care for millions of Americans. Add that to what we already know, which is with the tax cuts for upper income and wealthy Americans, it is leading to Republicans pushing for reduction in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Major pieces of the social justice infrastructure of the country. And whether you think the better strategic move, as we characterized it yesterday, is to walk or chew gum. I want to cite two different people. One, now you all have been very kind. I received one nasty note. And the nasty note said it was an insulting, disgusting show. It said some nasty things about the person who I am grateful to sit in for. And then it said nasty things about the fact that we covered healthcare yesterday rather than only bashing on Bob Mueller. And there were grains of validity in the critique. And I will share them. It was concerned. I think maybe the person hadn't listened to the Monday show where we covered this pretty much entirely for the entire 3 hours, but that I did not express sufficient outrage. Wondered if I didn't care. They talked about how a fight that they had witnessed, and they had felt really bad about that fight. In fact, they had gotten beaten up, and they felt even worse about the lack of an indictment of Donald Trump in this, than they had felt after they'd gotten beaten up. And, you know, it was an email from a listener, and it was hard to parse. But I understood part of that point. And I recognized that I was feeling it, and I wasn't wanting to bring it onto the air. That I, too, even though I knew it, even though in my frontal lobes, I'd said, listen, I will quote Paul Krugman, who had said, he said 3 points. We need to see the report, not just Trump appointees' summaries. Second, and importantly, anyone who thought Mueller was a silver bullet that would bring Trump down was living in a dream world. And third, the administration's corruption on multiple fronts is as obvious as ever. We can essentially agree on those points, I suspect. And I knew from the beginning, I saw what Mueller did in the NFL case. I looked at his background. There was no suggestion to me. There was no indication. There was no sufficient evidence. I did not have the hunch that Bob Mueller was a Ken Starr for the left or even the center, that he was somebody who was going to work really, really hard to try to disrupt a presidential administration. He did not seem to be that kind of person. But still, I will acknowledge, like that listener, and we got a couple phone calls yesterday who were perfectly polite and offered really smart points, but I could hear the anger in their voices. I could hear the rage. And I had written before the show, I hadn't said it, but I had written before the show, I do a bunch of writing to try to be ready. And I'd written before the show that our job is not to get people more angry. Our job is not to merely distribute heat, but to distribute light. That we want to lead with the facts, facts first, conclusions second. That we hope to inspire more than enrage. That we try not to stoke the divisions among us in the country, but find the ways that we can make democracy stronger. And in my writing, I realized I was giving myself a pep talk. in my preparations, I was trying to, because I recognize this show is not about my feelings or my outrage. I'm sitting in, I'm a guest. And ultimately, this show is about democracy and it's about you. And well, one instinct I had with this angry listener was to respond in kind. And they ended up, after a little bit of interchange, saying actually a couple of really nice things. I recognized that I had scrubbed a little bit my own emotional reaction. Maybe that's good. I want to manage my own anger. I want us to manage all of our angers. I've hurt people in my life. Many of us have hurt people in our lives. And I want to not stoke our baser instincts to punish our enemies merely for the purpose of punishment or merely for the purpose of making enemies. But I recognize that there ought to be space for the folks who have felt, who whether it was rational or strategic or accurate, or whether it was a good bet, were really hoping that investigation would lead to some clear conclusions that jibed on at least that third point from Krugman, the deep corruption in the White House that feels linked to children being in cages, to losing their health care. If you have feelings you want to share, call in. We're going to give you a chance.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program. The call-in number is 202-808-9925. I'm Jeff, and we'll be right back. Mike on Free Speech TV. You are our very first caller. Congratulations. You win the prize from Heathsville, Virginia. Mike, you there?
Yes.
Hey, how you doing?
How's it going?
It's going all right, man. You there?
Yes.
You're on the air. You're on the air, Mike. I'll give you one more chance if you can hear me.
Oh, okay. I was just saying, man, it's like, it's a lot of history that's been cut out of a lot of the public schools, just like the history of the Moors. You never hear nobody talk about that. But that's even black conventions. That's not black history. That's American history. It's like you got so many people that's been miseducated, even in your well-to-do schools. That's what happened to Glenn Beck. When he did that saga on black inventions, that was his downfall.
So you're making a couple points. I want to see if I can understand them. Well, let me ask this question instead. If there was something, if you think that American students are being miseducated, and there are certainly things that I think that are hugely important that are left out, certainly in historical analysis, if you could make sure that students were learning a thing or two that they're missing right now, what would that thing or two be?
A lot of true American history without being left out, like the history of the Moors.
Yeah.
And black inventions.
Yeah. History of the Moors and their
and was invented by African Americans that you never hear about.
Yeah, and say again the point you were making about Glenn Beck, that he was when he did black. Say that again.
I saw a segment that he did on black history and black inventions.
Yeah.
That he didn't even know about, and ever since then, I felt that was his downfall. His downfall. Why? Because his base left him, or because it demonstrated his own ignorance with respect to black history? Why do you think it led to his downfall? Because he was on a right-wing conservative, station, which was Fox.
Yeah.
And as soon as he opened that, as soon as he said about that, that was like you opened basically Pandora's box. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate it. And if there are things, and by the way, my Twitter handle is Jefferson D. Smith. If there are facts, if there are pieces of information you want to make sure the community is aware of, we won't be able to share everything, but you give us some good stuff, and we'll try to pass it along.
Yeah, and you have a different outlook on people of different backgrounds or different racial backgrounds if you actually knew the real history.
Yeah, it is a challenge that so much of American history and too much American history is white history, and there needs to be more than a month that's focused on understanding the depth and breadth of world history, including American history before the occupation by European settlers. And Mike, I do appreciate the call and the reminder. Thank you from Heatsville.
All right.
Appreciate it. We'll be back on the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith. What do you want to make sure we focus on? What do you think we've missed with respect to the Mueller investigation, the Barr letter? Have we not given enough airing of the frustration of the letdown? Or what do you want to pivot to? We'll be right back. You listen to Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith sitting in. Appreciate you listening. And I'll continue what I was saying. And then we'll go to your calls. That the critique, and I know it's funny, I'm a sensitive person, and it can get me into trouble. I'm a sensitive person. So I get, you get a bunch of praise, but oh, thank you, love it when you guest. It's, it's a different flavor of juice in the fridge, which can occasionally be fun. Sometimes fun to have the substitute teacher. I get that. And it feels really good when people say nice things. And of course, I fixate on the one person who came at me. But often if we listen to our critics, we can learn stuff. Sometimes they're just trolls. This wasn't a troll. This wasn't a Trump supporter or something. It wasn't somebody who was trying to lobby about Pizzagate. It was somebody who was angry that we focused on healthcare yesterday, instead of focusing on our rage and outrage and critiquing not only Barr, but also Mueller. And I get that. I want to give airing to that. But I also want to say something else, because it can be, I think, maybe more true for some than others. It is certainly true of me that I can avoid, I can be afraid of my own emotions. That too many of us, particularly males in the United States, are given cultural permission to express the emotion of anger, but to quell other emotions. And it's one of the damaging pieces of our culture, and I am certainly a part of it. I want to share one thing about why, for me, healthcare is not avoiding the hard part. Why it is not merely changing the subject from stuff that's important. Why healthcare is not just an academic exercise. Why it's not just avoiding the emotional side. But I did avoid sharing this. I didn't give my own sort of real feelings on why it matters to me. When I was in high school, and I was a sophomore in high school, my mother lost her health care. And the reason she lost her health care was because her doctor, she was an HMO, and her doctor had hit on her. And it was her assigned physician. So, you get the HMO and they give you a physician. So she had to cancel, in order not to have that doctor, she canceled her HMO. And within some number of days, she was talking to a client. She was a psychotherapist, and she was talking to a client, and she turned in her chair, and she had broken a rib. And she had known immediately that it was cancer. She got diagnosed, and turned out, yeah, it was. It was highly metastasized breast cancer that had gone throughout her bone structure, including her ribs, and that's why she'd broken her rib by just turning in her chair. She couldn't get health insurance because she had a pre-existing condition. She, fortunately, although she was a person of modest means, fortunately, her own father had some money, and pretty much the entirety of her life savings and life savings of some of her extended family members went to her health care. It would have been much more expensive now. It would have been probably a couple $1 million now. Then it was about $500,000, which was to us like all the money in the world at that time. And when I don't think that taking away people's health care is an academic issue. I don't think it is a political wedge. I don't think it is merely a convenient way to change the subject away from our rage. For so many people, it is deeply real. For me, it's deeply real because I just get frustrated. I get injured, and it's just a hassle, and it's really expensive. I haven't had to suffer a medical bankruptcy. I haven't lost my life. I haven't had a situation where I couldn't get the treatment I needed, and therefore my health got vastly worse. But I have lived through it, and I know what it's like. And after my mother passed away, it wrecked me, and I stayed wrecked for years, unable to deal with it. So anyway, I wanted to offer that response. I appreciate, I empathize with people's frustration, with feeling let down by an investigation that even I could say with my frontal lobes, oh yeah, this ain't gonna be the answer. Ultimately, this has to be won in the ballot box. It has to be won with public opinion. We have to not only win some investigation, we have to win the argument. Ultimately, democracy, I gave the example of Nixon. Hey, the toppling of Richard Nixon, the resignation of Richard Nixon did not lead to the decline of the right wing. In fact, you could almost time a significant growth trajectory of the right wing with Nixon's resignation. So we got to think bigger and think deeper than that, and I get that. But I don't want to cheapen people's feelings, and I don't want to fail to give space to the very real emotions that people have had, and how scared people are. How if you have a family member if you have a family member or a friend or a coworker or a neighbor who has been blocked from coming in this country, if you have a doctor who's had to leave because they're worried that because they are a Muslim and because they're here on a visa and they no longer think they can stay. An email like that was just sent to my wife from a colleague of hers at the medical center where she works. If you are somebody who's horrified by children being in literal cages, which they say aren't cages, but I saw them. I don't want to cheapen that. I don't want us to sanitize our emotion and our efforts, not just to feel rage and anger, not only so that we are uniters more than we are dividers. I don't want to be falsely positive, because I do get that. I do feel that. If you got stuff you want to share, we'll get to real stuff. That's enough venting from me. But I'm down to hear venting from you, and the call-in number is 202-808-9925. It's 202-808-9925. We'll offer not just heat, we'll offer some light. We'll get through some of the news that's happening over the last 24 hours. It's also happening in real time. And your phone calls right after this. I'm Jeff. This is Thom Show.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
This is the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jeff, and the number is 202-808-9925.
Our book club selection today is the brand new book from Dar Jamail, The End of Ice, Bearing Witness and Finding Meaning in the Path of Climate Disruption. The dedication of the book. This book is dedicated to the future generations of all species. Know that there were many of us who did what we could. This is from the introduction. The fall lasts long enough that I have time to watch the blue ice race upward, eons of time compressed into glacial ice, flashing by in fractions of seconds. I assume I've fallen far enough that I've pulled my climbing partner, Sean, into the crevasse with me. This is what it's like to die in the mountains, a voice in my head tells me. Just as my mind completes that thought, the rope wrenches my climbing harness up. I bounce languidly up and down as the dynamic physics inherent in the rope play themselves out. Somehow, Sean has checked my fall while still on the surface of the glacier. I brush the snow and chunks of ice from my hair, arms, and chest and pull down the sleeves of my shirt. Finding my glacier glasses hanging from the pocket of my climbing bib, I tuck them away. I check myself for injuries and incredibly find none. Assessing my situation, I find there's no ice shelf nearby to ease the tension from the rope so Sean can begin setting up a pulley system to extract me. I look down, nothing but blackness. I look at the wall of blue ice directly in front of me, take a deep breath, and peer up into the tiny hole into which I'd fallen when I'd punched through the snow bridge spanning the crevasse. The same bridge Sean had crossed without incident as we made our way up Alaska's Matanuska Glacier toward Mount Marcus Baker in the Chugach Range. You get to look down one more time, then that's it, I tell myself out loud. Again, there's only a black and void yawning beneath me, swallowing everything, even sound. My stomach clenches. I remind myself to breathe. Sean, are you okay? I yell as I clamp my mechanical ascenders to the rope in preparation to climb up. Yeah, I'm all right, but I'm right on the edge, he calls back. I can't set an anchor to get out of the system, so don't ascend. We're going to have to wait for the other guys to catch up. Time passes. The onset of hyperthermia means I can't control my body from periodically shaking. To ignore my fear of dying, I gaze meditatively at the ice a few feet in front of me as I dangle. The miniature air pockets found in the whiter ice near the top of the glacier have long since been compressed, producing the mesmerizing beauty of centuries-old turquoise ice. Slightly deeper into the crevasse is ice that has been there since long before the Neanderthals. I hang suspended in silence, mindful not to move out of fear of dislodging Sean. Giving my full attention to the ice immediately within my vision, I focus on how the gently refracting light from above seems to penetrate and reflect off the perfectly smooth wall. Staring into it, the blue seems infinite. Despite the danger of my situation, the glacier's beauty calms me. Delicate snowflakes and their infinite possibilities of form land on mountainous terrain. Under its own weight, the snow is compressed into glaciers that scour and shape the face of the earth. Countless millions of tons of weight, aided by the force of gravity, push and pull these frozen rivers downhill, carving out cirques and troughs from uplifted geologic plates and sculpting the majestic heights of mountains that I have been drawn to since I was young. Eventually, our other two teammates arrive and work to extract Sean from his perch just 6 inches from the edge of the crevasse. All three of them set up a three-way pulley system. Laboriously, my teammates begin to haul me up, inches at a time, out of what nearly became my tomb. I continue to focus on the delicately shifting blades of blue in the ice as I draw closer to the surface, mesmerized by its raw beauty. My teammates pull me up to the lip of the crevasse. I repeatedly plunge the pick of my ice axe into the snow and haul myself out, never before as grateful for being on top of a glacier. I stand and gaze up at the mountain to the west, behind which the sun has just set. Snow plumes stream off one of its ridges, turned into ruddy red ribbons by the setting snow. Snowflakes flicker as they float into space. As relief floods my shivering body, I roar in gratitude and relief. Utterly overwhelmed by being alive and surrounded by the beauty of the mountain world, I hug each of my three climbing partners. Now safe, it sinks in how close to death I've been. That was Earth Day 2003. In hindsight, I believe the emotion I felt then stemmed in part from something else. A deeper consciousness that the ice that I had seen, which had existed for eons, was vanishing. 7 years of climbing in Alaska had provided me with a front row seat from where I could witness the dramatic impact of human-caused climate disruption. Each year we found the toe of the glacier had shriveled further. Each year for the annual early ice season festival on this glacier, we found ourselves hiking further up the crusty frozen mud left behind by rapidly retreating terminus. Each year the parking lot was moved closer to the glacier, only to be left further away as the ice withdrew. Even sections of Denali, which stands over 20,000 feet tall and is roughly 250 miles from the Arctic Circle, had undergone startling changes. The ice of its glaciers was disappearing quickly. Our planet is rapidly changing, and what we are witnessing is unlike anything that has occurred in nature or even geologic history. The heat-trapping nature of carbon dioxide and methane, both greenhouse gases, has been scientific fact for decades. And according to NASA, there is no question that increased levels of greenhouse gases must cause the Earth to warm in response. Evidence shows the greenhouse gas emissions are causing the Earth to warm 10 times faster than it should. And the ramifications of this are being felt quite literally throughout the entire biosphere. And then, he goes on, oceans are warming, etc. The End of Ice by Dar Jamail.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Show. 3 words or phrases of the day were considered. I think, well, maybe we should have word of the day, phrase of the day, concept of the day. Someone said there are going to be 3. Before the end of the show, we're going to get to them. Stockdale paradox, cognitive dissonance, and zugzwang. That's what's called a teaser in the business, and by the business, I mean the industry. Let's go to your calls. We promised. From Puyallup, Washington, Antoinette, listening on KMBC. Hello, Antoinette.
Hello. I just wanted to say that something kind of simple. All this frustration and anger and rage can be directed. You can take those kinds of emotions and turn them into something positive by directing them in a positive way. And I think we should direct all our energy toward getting out the Democratic vote. There's people that are saying that if this happens or that happens, Trump could get reelected. Well, whatever we do, we have to make sure Trump doesn't get reelected. We should put all our energy into getting out people to vote, into making sure that they're not cheating and getting the Republicans aren't being able to get people off the voter polls. And once we, God willing, get a Democratic president in there, we should put our energy into repealing the Citizens Act and taking, elections out of the hands of the Koch brothers and people like them. That's all I have to say.
Amen, Antoinette. I think one of the, just to paraphrase, try to amplify what I heard you say, was channel frustration, channel anger, channel fear to positive activity. And a couple examples of positive activity are trying to win the big picture election that people are concerned about, and then make sure to prioritize democracy, prioritize the process, prioritize rooting out big scale voter suppression and big scale corruption so that democracy has a chance. Is that a fair summary?
Exactly. Perfect. Yes.
Thank you very much for the call.
That's what I think we need to do. Okay. You're welcome.
Appreciate it. Elizabeth from West Hollywood, California. My brother used to live in West Hollywood. How you doing, Elizabeth?
Hi. Okay.
Good.
I have worked with attorneys. I did for most of my working life, and in the courtroom.
Yeah.
And when I'm speaking about the Mueller report.
Sure.
And I've observed in some of these complex cases, they always leave the zinger until the end. And yes, he's completed his report, but he's had a lot of people prosecuted. However, he can't, given the current political thing, the situation the way it is, and the way the Republicans are, he's parceled out a lot of this information to the various states.
Sure.
And Trump has no power of veto, and if the various states want to prosecute him for all the crimes that he's committed, what I'm saying is Mueller is playing chess, and everybody else is talking checkers. And I think he's laid the groundwork for a very complex situation that's going to hit probably even the family members of Trump.
Yeah. So thank you for that call, and I want to agree and then offer my quibble. So the agreement is, I agree that it ain't over. The Mueller investigation is over, but as you pointed out, there have been cases that have been referred to the Southern District of New York, to the New York Attorney General, and the investigation over criminal activities by the Trump family and Trump Confederates, that isn't over. Given the current Department of Justice position on indicting the president, for which there is no statutory requirement that be their policy, but they don't want to indict their boss. Bill Barr is the kind of person who doesn't want to indict his boss, and some of that stuff may end up being delayed until after 2020 or after 2024. I know that year just scared you. that wouldn't necessarily be the case for Jared Kushner or Donald Trump Jr. I agree that's not over. I do think part of this question is, oh, well, Mueller, I have this fear, this is my quibble, I do have this fear that we built up Bob Mueller to be the strong-jawed savior. And it was a cop-out for us. I'm not saying that you're not, that you're trying to have a cop-out, but it gave us the excuse to say, oh, somebody else is going to take care of this problem. He's got the position, he's like the law, we can rely on the institutions, they'll do it for us. And while you may be, I think you're right that it isn't over, and I think there may have been, and I think some of those seeds were in fact planted by the Mueller investigation. I don't evaluate the guy to think that I want to put all my faith in him, but I also want to make sure we don't embrace that possible cop-out to not put the onus on us to make sure that our voting systems, that the money that works its way through the political system, that the issues that are taken on, that the people who are elected in primaries and general elections, that the overall apparatus and systems by which we govern ourselves, that we not neglect those thinking that the dude in the white horse with the good jaw is going to save us. I think that's the third time I've talked about his jaw. I guess I'm fixated on his jaw. I don't mean to be. All right. Sutherland, Oregon. I've been to Sutherland. What's up, Lisa from Sutherland, Oregon? How you doing?
You've been to Sutherland,
yes.
Oregon? 13 churches and 7,000 people.
It is a little town.
Yes, it's a little red town, and I'm from Long Island, New York, and I've lived all up and down in the northeastern region of the United States and worked in Southern California to Southern Oregon in the insurance industry. I went back to school and taught, and I come from a family of foreign service. I am so grateful for Tom's show and for you, Jefferson, for stepping in and doing such a wonderful job for Tom. Tom is a scholar, and I tell everybody I know about free speech TV and radio. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And by the way, you don't have to answer it. So yeah, Roseburg's just on the way. The reason I've been there is because it's on the way to, you pass through Sutherland when you go from, if you head to, okay, so for out-of-towners, all right, out-of-towners, here's how you might go through Sutherland. That if you want to go to the Ashland Shakespeare Festival, it's one of the great Shakespeare festivals in the country, and you're driving Southern Oregon, and if you're driving from Eugene or Portland, Eugene is where University of Oregon is, and you want to stop at a place called Rice Hill, because Rice Hill has an ice cream place where you order a single scoop and it's like 9 scoops. It's actually just 2, but 2 big scoops, huge scoop. And then you go on your way to Roseburg, and Sutherland's in between those 2 places. What brought you to Sutherland from Long Island?
Well, actually, I was in Northern California and Southern California at the time I came here. I was going to retire. I was about 55 years old. I was leaving a relationship, and a friend, my real estate consultant, he sent me to his former boss in Oregon, and I just fell in love. I was at the Umpqua River at their house.
It's a beautiful place.
She and her husband had a house on the river, and I stayed with them, and they showed me property, and I'm like, oh my God. So anyway, I
apologize. I know you didn't call in to talk about Southern Oregon, but that's my fault, not yours. What point do you want to make, or what question do you want to ask?
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, so I read that the House Democrats voted something. I mean, the entire House voted 425, or I can't remember.
420 to 0.
Was it 420 to 0?
Yep.
Oh my God. So anyway, so,
yeah. I don't know if you're a weed smoker, but I caught the laugh. Keep going.
So anyway, and that vote was specifically, I understand, to release the full Mueller report, non-redacted, right?
Yep.
Okay, so Attorney Barr, who had written a 9-page memo, I think Tom talked about this or somebody, before he even was appointed, I don't know when, that a sitting president could never be indicted or something along those lines. That it was
very hard. That it was hard to indict a president, and very importantly and specifically, that getting a president for obstruction of justice was darn nigh impossible. Both because if you're making the claim that some of that obstruction of justice was the offering of pardons, well, it couldn't be obstruction of justice because the president could offer a pardon to anybody who wants to. That's a really stupid argument. I can explain why I say so. And then the other one being you can't obstruct if there was no underlying crime. Also a stupid argument, and I'll say so. I said so before. Why? And I'm happy to say so again. But keep it going.
Well, see, this is what's a little bit confusing here. We have, I understand that the executive branch has a tremendous amount of power, but so does the House so does Congress. So I always call in, and I recommend everyone does. The Capitol switchboard. You only get a couple of seconds anyway, 30 seconds or a minute, and you're either recorded or you're talking to a staff member that's telling you you only have a couple of seconds to, and they'll let you through. I mean, they'll take your message. So we need to participate in indivisible, all of Bernie's stuff, the Sanders Institute, all of that good stuff, and support everybody, because everybody's got a good point in the Democratic Party. But anyway, I don't want to get off on all that. What this whole thing, I want to know if Barr can be impeached, because the House voted unanimously, as far as I can tell. Can they impeach him because he refuses to reduce what the taxpayers paid for? We paid for this.
Yeah, ultimately, you have the same, many questions, including the same question about impeaching the president, which would have to go through the Senate, and we know how that would land, which is another reason why I think we have to put the onus on ourselves. We'll be back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
This is the Thom Hartmann Show. The call-in number is 202-808-9925. So, Lisa, I do want to get to the next call, but does that make sense? So the answer to your question, I think, is forestalled by it would end up going through the same political process, the same analysis that Nancy Pelosi did. They said, well, we could try to impeach this guy, but I already know if Mitch McConnell is not even willing to let the Mueller report come out after a unanimous vote in the House, if Mitch McConnell is not going to let the report come out unredacted, so it's going to get anything damaging the president, anything that suggests obstruction of justice is almost certainly going to be redacted. Why would he possibly allow a vote on impeachment of a Trump administration official?
Well, this is a teachable moment, and we could, there are so many topics you brought up, about obstruction of justice by the, the minority leader in the Senate, the Republican, by Devin Nunes. I mean, we could get into so many things, but the point is that thank God you and Tom are there to help us sort it out. I can't even keep up. I go, I work too, and we all do.
People got lives. People got lives, and they got to work. And this is one of the things this is one of the glitches in the system. This is what, I have this grand unified theory. It's not exactly that, but this different understanding that than I hear from most pundits and most news analysts, most journalists, is that things changed after Watergate. And they didn't just change because then the media got the taste of blood and decided they wanted to take down politicians because they saw that the best way to be the most famous journalist was to do that. But maybe even more importantly, the right wing learned from that experience and started acting. And I don't mean by that they cleaned up their act. I mean, they recognized that they needed to start changing the institutions. They needed to change the media. They needed to change the investigation structure. That they also need to change their own strategy and tactics in relationship to investigations. That ultimately, one of the things that they can rely upon is that people are busy. I don't subscribe to the notion that everybody's a bunch of dum-dums. That's not how I see the world. But I do think people are busy. They have other things going on. They rely on proxies. They rely on people they think they might be able to trust for information. And that it's so hard to get into all this. And this is the perfect time. Well, actually, I'll do it right after the next break. I want to comment a little bit about how the media has treated this stuff. But your point is so important about how folks are busy. And that's one of the reasons why we have to build a community for democracy. So we have people upon whom we can rely who have some shared objective to make the country work better. Lowell, Salem, Oregon.
Hey, Jefferson. So I wanted to bring up just a reminder of some of the history of the people we're dealing with.
Yep.
So, for example, William Barr was, under George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan, and he got George H.W. Bush off for treason, and as well as exonerated all the people from the Iran-Contra scandal.
Yep.
And then Bob Mueller, testified that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. So we're not exactly looking at people who are not company men, as they would say.
Right, and Bill Barr, yeah, William Safire called Bill Barr cover-up general, and we had got CK, one of our listeners, offered a bunch of phrases that that we want to, and maybe I can go through some of those later in the show that CK was hoping that we would that people might adopt. She had different. CK had a different. They had a different name for Barr, but William Safire's was cover-up general. The Mueller stuff is also important, Lowell. Thank you for reminding us.
All right, thank you.
Appreciate it. We'll be right back here on the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jeff Smith. You're you. Who watches The Watchmen? If the press, if the media, if journalists are supposed to help us understand what's going on, who is helping us understand what is going on with journalists and with media and with news? Howard Dean commented out, I confess to being disgusted with the American media in general. Just heard again on NPR that the Mueller report cleared President Trump. No one in the American media has read the Mueller report. There's two thoughts in there that I want to address. One is this idea, and I think it is useful for our listeners, for our community, to be vigilant. And even to make comments. You can use social media and tag people. You can email in, even call in to news stations who do it wrong. When the shorthand is used, the Mueller report cleared President Trump, that is inaccurate, and that inaccuracy matters. It's inaccurate for what Howard Dean pointed out, that the Mueller report has not been seen by anybody in the American media, so we don't know what it says. But lest that seem like a lazy point, anybody who thought that there was going to be easy evidence of a conspiracy between this president and the president of Russia, that there was going to be some tape or some Russian witness of the 30 who were indicted who are not extraditable, and therefore we never heard from them, and the notes from the interpreter were confiscated, and there were multiple people murdered. Remember the guy who was Mikhail Lesin, who was murdered in Washington, D.C. the night before meeting with the U.S. Justice Department just a year before the election. And then a year after the election, the Department of Justice came out and said, and this guy had been the head of communications for Putin and had fallen out of Putin. It looked like he was going to turn state's evidence. Just a year before the election, he dies. Almost exactly, like November 5th. A year after the election, the now Trump-controlled DOJ comes out and they drop any charges, and their explanation is that he got drunk and fell down a bunch of times. He was bludgeoned at his head, around his body, and his chest multiple times. And so what they said was, instead of what looked like, what two FBI agents had said off the record, that it looked like he'd been killed by a baseball bat, instead the new explanation was that he'd gotten drunk, fallen down, decided to get up, fallen down again, decided to get up, fallen down again, and continued that until he perished. And that became the official story. It's absurd. And if we thought that there was going to be proof of some, secret meetings that we didn't know about, I don't know, I never thought that was very likely. So therefore, that's why, and in part because there was a risk of obstruction of justice. And that's why the obstruction of justice thing is so important, why what actually Mueller said, what actually happened, what Mueller didn't say, why that stuff is really important. So when the media goes out and say, oh, Trump was cleared, that isn't accurate. To say that the Justice Department, to say that Bill Barr has declined to bring charges, that's accurate. News media should say that. But not bringing charges is very different from clearing. Let me give you an example. And it's almost a morality play that it's happening at the same time. This is one of the three phrases of the day, cognitive dissonance. Because it's amazing to me this stuff is happening. And by the way, I am a victim of this too. I have the same risk for heuristics, for mental errors, that any one other human being might have. I don't very much care about the Jussie Smollett case. It received hours and hours and hours of coverage on CNN while there was very little coverage of the fact that millions of Americans might have their health care eliminated. That's a vastly bigger story than Jussie Smollett. But Jussie Smollett's a really interesting story. Did he or did he not pay a couple people to beat him up so that he could and fake a white supremacist beating so that he could build his career in Hollywood? Charges were dropped. Charges were dropped just recently. News media covers it all over the place. Rahm Emanuel comes out, says it's disgraceful. Charges were dropped. Prosecutor comes out and says, I still think Jussie Smollett is guilty. Now, dropping charges against Jussie Smollett is very different than clearing Jussie Smollett. It's very different than other headlines I've seen, like findings of no collusion, findings of no crime. There was not a finding of no collusion or a finding of no crime, or there certainly was not a finding of no evidence of a crime. What there was were no charges, and that matters. And how we talk about that there are no charges, we shouldn't assume someone is guilty merely because we hope them to be guilty, but we also should be careful about our headlines, and here's why that matters. The cognitive dissonance point is that you had on the same channels. So the same channels who are saying, aha, Trump is cleared, Fox News obviously taking that tack, and going even further saying, and therefore there should be heck to pay by anybody who thought there might be anything to see in the Mueller investigation. It was a witch hunt of 37 people who actually got indicted. Multiple people actually went to jail. Of interference with elections that actually is now essentially the consensus viewpoint. So if it was a witch hunt, witches are real. But then at the same time saying, well, Jussie Smollett clearly did it, even though there are no charges being brought. Cognitive dissonance is this idea of twisting the facts so that they comport to, so you fill in the gaps so they stick with your predetermined conclusions. Who watches The Watchmen? All of us need to. One thing that this community can do, one way we can have leverage, to cite our previous listener, one way we can turn our anger, our frustration, our disappointment, our even outrage towards positive activity, is to at least watch The Watchmen, to at least email in, tweet out, call in to news organizations, say, hey, please do be careful with those headlines. Because then what happens is if quickly the consensus is not, hey, there might be a cover-up, or the consensus isn't, oh yeah, it looked like some really nasty stuff, but on this particular question it wasn't charged. Now, was it not charged because of prosecutorial cowardice? Was it not charged because of obstruction of justice? Or was it not charged because the facts really prove something different entirely? But instead, then the propaganda machine, directed by this White House, can try to immediately pivot and say, aha, well, clearly, he was cleared, full exoneration, and therefore we should punish others, and we should send our press release saying that those people should not even have a public hearing. That's what's happening right now. We're going to take your calls after this.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
Over at ThomHartmann.com, we've got some really cool stuff. A lot of people don't realize that we produce a daily newsletter, and Sue puts we call it Sue's Daily Stack on there, which is literally a link to every story that I've talked about in the show. So all the research is right there. It's free. We don't share or sell our subscriber list. It's there's just it's there. It's there for you. And it's over at thomhartmann.com. You can sign up for the free newsletter. You also can get my big picture take of the day, which is exclusively over at our website at thomhartmann.com, as well as links to our videos, the book reports we typically do every day, all this stuff and more. It's all there at thomhartmann.com. So check it out and sign up for our newsletter. I think you'll really enjoy it and appreciate it and find a lot of value there. We put a lot of work into this stuff, and you'll find it all right there on our website at thomhartmann.com. And be sure to check out the newsletter and sign up for it. It's great. For our book today, we're reading from Elon Papp's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. This is from the preface. It's titled The Red House. The Red House was a typical early Tel Avivian building, the pride of the Jewish builders and craftsmen who toiled over in the 1920s. It had been designed to house the head office of the local Workers' Council. It remained such until toward the end of 1947 it became the headquarters of the Haganah, the main Zionist underground militia in Palestine. Located near the sea on Yarkon Street in the northern part of Tel Aviv, the building formed another fine addition to the first Hebrew city in the Mediterranean, the White City, as its literati and pundits affectionately called it. For in those days, unlike today, the immaculate whiteness of his houses still bathed the town as a whole in the opulent brightness so typical of Mediterranean port cities of that era and that region. It was a sight for sore eyes, elegantly fusing Bauhaus motifs with native Palestinian architecture in an admixture that was called Levantine, in the least derogatory sense of the term. Such too was the Red House, its simple rectangular features graced with frontal arches that framed the entrance and supported the balconies of its two upper stories. It was either its association with the workers' movement that had inspired the adjective red, or its pinkish tinge that it acquired during sunset that had given the house its name. The former was more fitting, as the building continued to be associated with the Zionist version of socialism when, in the 1970s, it became the main office for Israel's kibbutzim movement. Houses like this, important historical remnants of the mandatory period, prompted UNESCO in 2003 to designate Tel Aviv as a World Heritage Site. Today, the house is no longer there, a victim of development, which has razed this architectural relic to the ground to make room for a car park next to the new Sheraton Hotel. Thus, in this street, too, no trace is left of the White City, which it has slowly transmorgified into the sprawling, polluted, extravagant metropolis that is the modern Tel Aviv. In this building on a cold Wednesday afternoon, 10 March 1948, a group of 11 men, veteran Zionist leaders, together with young military Jewish officers, put the final touches on a plan for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. That same evening, military orders were dispatched to the units on the ground to prepare for the systematic expulsion of Palestinians from vast areas of the country. The orders came from a detailed description of the methods to be employed to forcibly evict the people: large-scale intimidation, laying siege to and bombarding villages and population centers, setting fire to homes, properties, goods, expulsion, demolition, and finally planting mines among the rubble to prevent any of the expelled inhabitants from returning. Each unit was issued with its own list of villages and neighborhoods as the targets of the master plan. Codenamed Plan D, Dalet in Hebrew, this was the fourth and final version of less substantial plans that outlined the fate the Zionists had in store for Palestine and consequently for its native population. The previous three schemes had articulated only obscurely how the Zionist leadership contemplated dealing with the presence of so many Palestinians living in the land that the Jewish national movement coveted as its own. This fourth and last blueprint spelled it out clearly and unambiguously. Quote, "The Palestinians have to go," end quote. In the words of one of the first historians to note the significance of that plan, Simcha Flapan, the military campaign against the Arabs, including the conquest and destruction of the rural areas, was set forth in the Haganah's Plan Dalet. The aim for the plan was, in fact, the destruction of both the rural and urban areas of Palestine. As the first chapters of this book will attempt to show, this plan was both the inevitable product of the Zionist ideological impulse to have an exclusively Jewish presence in Palestine, and a response to developments on the ground once the British cabinet had decided to end the mandate. Clashes with local Palestinian militias provided the perfect context and pretext for implementing the ideological vision of an ethnically cleansed Palestine. The Zionist policy was first based on retaliation against Palestinian attacks in February of 1947, and it transformed into an initiative to ethnically cleanse the country as a whole in March of 1948. Once the decision was taken, it took 6 months to complete the mission. When it was over, more than half of Palestine's native population, close to 800,000 people, had been uprooted. 531 villages had been destroyed, and 11 urban neighborhoods had been emptied of their inhabitants. The plan decided upon on 10 March 1948, and above all, its systematic implementation in the following months, was a clear-cut case of ethnic cleansing operation, regarded under international law today as a crime against humanity. After the Holocaust, it has become impossible to conceal large-scale crimes against humanity. Our modern communication-driven world, especially since the upsurge of electronic media, no longer allows human-made catastrophes to remain hidden from the public eye or to be denied. And yet one such crime has been erased almost totally from the global public memory: the disposition of the Palestinians in 1948 by Israel. This, the most formative element in the modern history of the land of Palestine, has ever since been systematically denied and is still today not recognized as an historical fact, let alone acknowledged as a crime that needs to be confronted politically as well as morally. Ethnic cleansing is a crime against humanity, and the people who perpetrate it today are considered criminals to be brought before special tribunals. It may be difficult to decide how one ought to refer to or deal with in the legal sphere those who initiated and perpetrated ethnic cleansing in Palestine in 1948. But it's impossible to reconstruct their crimes. Anyhow, it continues the ethnic cleansing of Palestine.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
How is the media doing when it comes to Trump corruption? And I want to paint the media in one obvious, simple, monotheistic, monochromatic brush. But I do want to evaluate, and I want us to evaluate how it's doing. I have the concern, I think there is a concern, that in the shorthand of describing the Barr letter, there is words like, he's cleared, which then seems to jibe with the president saying full exoneration, which then seems to jibe with their move to try to punish anybody who thought otherwise. Care and attention to this seems important to me. What do you think? A calling number? Yes, it's a calling number. 202-808-9925, 202-808-9925. I brought up something yesterday that I want to give a somewhat related word to today. And it's not entirely, it's not the perfect word, but it's a very useful word to know. And shout out to TV show Billions. The word is zugzwang. Zugzwang is in chess when you force your opponent to make a move that your opponent would really not like to make. And I think there is a rhetorical version of zugzwang that's been going on. And the only reason, the primary reason, well, it's not chess, but the word is not perfect, is it's not actually forcing. But it's pretty close. It's pretty close to forcing. The zugzwang that's going on is when the now president, then candidate, Trump, says, the election is rigged. And everybody responds who doesn't like the president, saying, no, it's not rigged. The election is great. When later it looks like there are problems with the election, you have to sort of backtrack. It's kind of hard. Forcing your opponent to disagree with you, and then your opponent is then stuck with a position they kind of wish they maybe didn't have. Bob Mueller's a fraud. And then getting a bunch of people who don't like the president say, no, Bob Mueller, unimpeachable, strong jaw, was in the military, said that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It's got to be great. Rhetorically forcing opponents of the president to endorsing Bob Mueller, maybe to a greater degree than they would have liked. They could have said, well, let's evaluate Bob Mueller Let's not just put all our faith in that. In fact, then saying, hey, we can't do anything until we get the Mueller report because that'll tell us everything. And then, oh, wait, we're not going to get the Mueller report? Zug's way. And now more recently, Donald Trump saying, the media, fake news, can't trust the media, media's terrible. And getting all sorts of people oppose the president saying, no, the media's great. We got to support journalists. Everybody re-up your membership to your local news outlet or your national favorite newspaper. Endorse the newspapers. They're our hope. Providing endorsement that sometimes is justified and sometimes isn't, but can be overstated. I think we have to be careful. I am not here to bash the media. I don't think there is one thing that is the media. But I do think we have to be vigilant. Someone has to watch the watchman. So if you wanted a word for the day, Zug's way. Forcing your opponent to do something your opponent doesn't really want to do. And my quasi-application of that to the current rhetorical moves by the president. Let's take some calls. Let's go to our friend Will in Santa Barbara, California. How you doing, Will?
Hey, I'm doing pretty good. Thanks for taking my call.
Yep.
Love the show, and you're doing a great job filling in for Tom.
Thanks.
Hey, so I'm an Iraq War veteran,
Yep.
and I want to take a look at this whole thing through the lens of media war machine propaganda.
Yep.
One of the things that propaganda studies teaches us is that we have to look at who benefits from a story. So I recently read an article. Go on ahead.
Que bono. It's the Latin. It might be qui bono.
Yeah.
Nobody knows how to pronounce Latin anymore, but
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you.
Who benefits?
Okay, so who benefits? One, a corrupted Democratic Party benefits because now it's not their fault that they lost 2016 if this collusion story is true.
Yep.
Second thing that benefits, the war machine, the defense contractors that want an arms race with Russia to continue, they benefit. We have Democrats and so-called liberals now talking about how Russia is our enemy. No, they're not. We sit on the Security Council of the UN together. We're all allies. So, again, Russia, Trump has gone against Russia's interest in many cases. He pulled out of the INF Treaty, Venezuela, etc. So it kind of falls apart. So my first point is, let's look at this thing as war machine propaganda. For me, that makes sense. My second point I'd like to make real quick is, given that, let's just fast forward a year, and let's say that the Trump and the Republicans spin on this is the one that most people agree with, that this has been a witch hunt, that nothing really came of it. Who is the Democratic candidate who is most likely to be differentiated from the DNC to have a shot at beating Trump? Because if you have somebody who looks like the Democratic establishment, they're going to smell like Russiagate, and it's going to be really hard for them to beat Trump. So who is the one person, I'm asking you, who is the one person in the Democratic field that is the most differentiated from the Democratic establishment?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't yet know. If I would say a thought that occurred to me. I think that occurred to me was one that I don't know the one you're thinking. You might be thinking Bernie, you might be thinking somebody else. But I will quote a candidate who essentially shares my viewpoint on this. And I have some agreement, some disagreement with your point. But Pete Buttigieg had the following to say, and no, Nate, it is not Pete Buttigieg. That is not accurate. Buttigieg. I had said Buttigieg a bunch of times, and then I saw how he pronounces it himself. And he said, this campaign can't be about Trump. Part of how we lost our way in 2016 was it was too much about him, and it left a lot of people back home saying, okay, but nobody's talking about me. So I think that the candidate, I don't know if it's if I would go so far as to say it's the candidate that's the least outside the Democratic establishment. He might be that because he's been a local, small town, mid-sized town mayor. But but I do think it's the candidates who are focused on stuff that intersect with people's lives. And I'd put a plug in for Elizabeth Warren, who's on that at least, because she's gone bold on wealth disparities, gone bold on more policy issues than I've seen from any current candidate. But who are you thinking?
Well, I'm absolutely thinking Bernie Sanders is by far the most differentiated from all the Democratic establishment. I do like Pete. I think in 10 years, 20 years after we see how he votes, because you can have all the story you want to have, but it comes down to how do you actually vote? Do you vote for the corporations or do you vote for the people? So I want to see more. I don't think we need a 37-year-old president. He might be a vice presidential candidate, but Bernie has a clear distinction. He is a differentiated product from everybody else. If you want to put somebody up there against Trump who doesn't smell like DNC hoax and establishment bullcrap, we have to go for Bernie now.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the call, and I do. This is really tricky, and it gets us tangled in knots. And I'm going to tangle myself. I may tangle myself in a knot, but because I do think there is a major argument happening in the country that I want to talk about after our next break, and that is what is the power dynamic in the world right now, and how do we need to be aware of that power dynamic, and how do we want to interact with that power dynamic? I think that's really important. I don't think it's a bilateral world, the United States and Russia. That's not how I see the world. But I also don't want to say, well, anybody who critiques Russia, we should treat Russia as our ally. Anybody who critiques Russia is clearly in cahoots with ne'er-do-wells, and therefore whoever's the most friendly with Russia, in the Democratic side, that's Bernie, and the Republican side, that's Donald Trump. We should then like that person. That's not exactly my view. I'll offer my view after this break, but do appreciate your calls. The call-in number here is 202-808-9925. We'll be doing a speed round in a little bit.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We're going to talk about the dynamics of world power. What? It's a big topic. 202-808-9925. Donald from Greensboro, North Carolina, you're on the air. Free Speech TV.
Okay.
Thanks for watching it.
Okay, appreciate the show and the program here. Do you want me to be limited to talking about world powers, or can we?
No, speak your piece, man.
Okay. Well, I'm concerned that the democratic process in this country has been lost. We have company people, Bob Mueller, a company person. We have a DNC under Deborah Wasserman Schultz that control which Democrat is going to come to the forefront and push Bernie aside for Hillary. When that was time to elect a DNC chairperson, it was Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama that wanted Perez over other people that the progressives want. The process keeps pushing us to these company people that's protecting the company. Barack Obama, when he come in here, he put more people in jail under the Espionage Act than all the other presidents combined. As soon as we went out to the polls to elect him, he started bringing in the likes of Geithner, or Jack Lew, or Larry Summers. We elect people who are corporate company Democrats, and voting is not going to change this system. We have a government that has no interest in what the public wants. If 90% of Americans say there should be background checks, Washington says later for that. If Pew polls say 6 out of 10 Americans want legal abortions in this country, Washington says forget about that. We have a government that has no interest in the people, and no matter whether we vote for Barack or DNC put in Tom Perez.
You don't think any of it matters?
It matters to the point that we got to get a democracy where the people are listened to and heard. Yeah. And if 90% of Americans want background checks, who in Washington is listening to the people? Nobody.
Yeah, and that's a great example. In fact, I'll amplify before I quibble. So the Princeton paper that came out, I need to remember the names of the authors, but the Princeton paper that came out that said that the United States is no longer a democracy, and the evidence they used was they tracked the compared congressional decisions to the viewpoint of the majority of Americans, and found essentially no meaningful correlation between the viewpoint of the majority of Americans and congressional decisions. And then they looked at the viewpoint of wealthy Americans, of economic elites, and compared those viewpoints with congressional decisions. And there was a very strong correlation. The rich people wanted stuff, it happened in Congress. If regular people wanted stuff, well, maybe it happened in Congress, maybe it didn't. So the way to lobby Congress was to lobby rich people, not to lobby Congress. And so that's the amplification. I do think on something like background checks, party control matters a lot. Because on background checks, it's not, the difference is clear. There's some places where the difference isn't clear. But when Ralph Nader came out and said there's no difference, Ralph Nader had been an American hero, right? In 1973, I still think there ought to be a book about 1973 as the year that changed America. But 1973, he had a 90% approval rating. But when he said there was no difference between Democrats and Republicans, I thought that was one of the most important misstatements made in the last 20 years in American politics. There are important differences, and background checks happen to be one of those big differences. But I agree with you, ultimately, we got to fight not just for any Democratic Party, but for democracy, and that's got to be what we focus on. I appreciate your call. We'll be back. Hi, everybody. How you doing? This is the Thom Hartmann Show. If that sounded like keeping a smiling face around a shrinking middle class, a subverted democracy, and a melting planet, well, you caught me. That's what it was. Trying to stay happy. And this is my thought. I've been trying to think about if this opportunity is not an opportunity merely to entertain or an opportunity to enrage. I think one of the big reasons that right-wing radio caught fire was it had an obvious emotional palette, and it was anger, contempt, disgust, and fear. And those are, for a lot of psychologists, who count to 7 basic emotions. Not every psychologist sees it that way. But, you know, that's the majority of them, and pretty powerful ones. I hope that we are here not merely to stoke anger, contempt, disgust, and fear. I hope we are occasionally here to inspire, occasionally here to educate, occasionally here at least to be in community around how we can do stuff. And therefore, what should be our attitude as a community? Should we be outraged? There is justification for outrage. Should we be hopeful and optimistic and committed to the next steps of what we need to do? Should we be crestfallen and disappointed? Should we avoid the issues facing the country entirely? Because it's so much nicer just to get a new end table and watch something and chill. It's so much nicer to, oh, look, on my phone, I can order food and it gets delivered here. I don't even have to go outside. And then I can click. I now have a myriad of entertainment. If I'm homesick, I'm not just limited to the choices of Big Valley. I can watch like anything. What should be our attitude? Here's my third phrase of the day, word of the day, concept of the day that captures the attitude that I advocate. It's the Stockdale paradox. Hat tip to Jim Collins. Admiral John Stockdale, who was, prior to being Ross Perot's vice presidential candidate, prior to being a Saturday Night Live skit, was an American hero, highest ranking officer in the Hanoi Hilton. And he was asked what differentiated the people who made it out of the Hanoi Hilton, who made it out of Vietnam prison camps, versus the people who did not make it out. And he said, well, the people who didn't make it out fell into 2 categories, the pessimists and the optimists. The pessimists, the people who had no hope. They say, we're never getting out of here, and they would lose hope, and they didn't make it. And there are the optimists, who said, oh, we're going to be out by Thanksgiving. And then Thanksgiving would come, and they'd still be there. We're going to be out by Christmas. And then Christmas would come, and they'd still be there. we're going to be out by Easter. And Easter would come, and eventually they would lose that optimism. They would lose hope, and they didn't make it. That ultimately the people who were able to maintain strength to make it out, according to Admiral John Stockdale, of a prison camp, were the people who were able to simultaneously, hat tip to F. Scott Fitzgerald perhaps, simultaneously be brutally honest about the critical facts that are facing the situation and be ultimately confident in eventual success. People could say, I don't know when we're getting out of here. It's going to be really hard. It's going to be painful. We're not going to get to eat well. We're going to be in physical pain. We're going to be cold. We're going to be in fear. And we don't know when it's going to happen, and it might take a really long time. The people who are brutally honest about the critical facts facing the situation. But also the people who had ultimate confidence in eventual success. Eventually, we're getting out of here. If we can be strong enough, if we can keep our wits about us, if when it's cold, we can huddle together, if we're in pain, if we can make it through, if ultimately we can stay strong, we can eventually get out of here. That Stockdale paradox, that ability to be brutally honest with the critical facts and ultimately confident in eventual success was indicative of it correlated, maybe even led to the ability to survive horrible conditions. I am suggesting this for our community, my guest appearance, as our collective understanding, as our commitment, as our attitude. It might not be that some appointee by this Justice Administration finds every fact and draws every conclusion and files every indictment that needs to be filed. It might not be that every possible witness from another country who's not extraditable is able to come and give state's evidence. It might not be that the hand-picked Attorney General who previously had cleared another president and whitewashed a set of investigations. It might not be that that person would decide, when given the choice, whether to indict over obstruction of justice, will in fact indict over obstruction of justice. It might not be that the media institutions will help everyone understand what is happening with wealth disparities, will properly prioritize climate change as a news item, will properly communicate what's happening with the undermining of democracy, will properly even challenge their own advertisers and the roles their own advertisers are playing in our current conundrums. Conundrum? It might not be that impeachable offenses are brought to a U.S. Senate. It might not be that every election is won. It might not be that children who are left locked in cages will be immediately released. It might not be that the arc of history will be bent towards justice in the next several months. We need to be brutally honest with the facts facing our situation. We also have to be ultimately confident in the eventual success of democracy. We have to have rigor. We have to have durability. We have to stick together. And thanks for sticking with us. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann Show. We'll be back with Thomas Wolfe from the Brennan Center right after this.
Our book today is The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America by Greg Grandin. And this is from Chapter 1, entitled All That Space. The British colonies in North America were conceived in expansion. America was an aspiration, an errand, and an obligation born out of violent Christian schism and Europe's interminable religious and imperial conflicts. Depending on the intricacies of their particular interpretations of Revelation, the Protestants who settled New England might have understood flight across the Atlantic as a way of escaping European war, or they might have seen migration as a chance to open a new front and win those wars on a new soil. Here in the 1600s, in the eschatological nebula of the New World, was the first paradoxical image of America as simultaneously pristine and despoiled, empty and at the same time filled with primitives begging for deliverance, subordinated to Catholic Spain, which had conquered its part of the Americas a century earlier and stood as the great obstacle to Reformation England's rise as a world power. All yell and cry with one voice, Libertia, Libertia, Richard Hakluyt, a clergyman and court minister, wrote in the late 1500s, hoping to convince investors and his queen to establish an American colony. As Puritan society frayed under the harsh conditions of settler life, the frontier threatened and beckoned. The dark woods were filled with witches, and they were witchy, inviting hither. The forest was the place where the community could be redeemed and given new purpose, a chance to once again start anew, or it could be a place of more sorrows, wilderness sorrows, as two early Puritan patriarchs described the hardships that awaited those who ventured into uncharted territory, where whatever solidarity existed would be smashed into atoms as settlers scattered to escape the rule of the clergy. People are ready to run wild into the woods again and to be as heathenish as ever, warned Increase Mather. Expansions could be, often in the same sermon, held up as the cause of and the solution to the difficulties of establishing Christian communities. Either way, Native Americans had to get out of the way. They could die. They waste, they molder away, they disappear, said one Puritan chronicler of indigenous people who had succumbed to European pestilence years before the arrival of the Mayflower in 1620, thus clearing the earth for the establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. God made way for his people by removing the heathen and planting them in the ground, said another observer. They could be murdered. The holy terror unleashed by the Puritans was, according to the historian Bernard Bailyn, driven by fears of what could happen to civilized people in an unimaginable wilderness and fears of racial conflicts in which God's children were fated to struggle with pitiless agents of Satan, pagan antichrists swarming in the world around them. Survivors could be enslaved. The first patent granted in colonial America in 1626 was to a Virginia merchant and planter, William Claiborne, for inventing a device that would not just restrain Indians, but also make them work. Claiborne was given an Indian to experiment on for the trial of his invention. Colonial records do not say what this innovation might have been, only noting that it was not successful. Or they could be pushed further and further west. The prodigious and relentless population, complained New Orleans Spanish governor in 1794, progressively drives the Indian nations before them and upon us, seeking to possess for itself this vast continent which the Indians occupy between the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Appalachian Mountains. More than a century and a half later, writing in the early 1950s, the Mexican author and diplomat Octavio Paz made much the same point. America was, he writes, if anything, geography, pure space, open to human action. Since it lacked historical substance, ancient social classes, established institutions, religions, and hereditary laws, reality presented no obstacles other than natural ones. Men struggled not against history, but against nature. And wherever there was an historical obstacle, indigenous societies say, it was simply erased from history, reduced to a mere natural fact and dispensed with accordingly. Evil is outside, part of the natural world, like Indians, rivers, mountains, and other obstacles that must be domesticated or destroyed. End of quote. The American Revolution is a permanent revolution, Paz went on, a nonstop expulsion of, quote, all elements foreign to the American essence, and a constant invention of itself. And anything that stands in the way of that invention, anything that is in any way irreducible or inassimilable to perpetual creation, be it Native American, Spanish America, or history itself, quote, is not American. Quote, in other places, the future is one of man's attributes because we are men. We have a future. In Saxon America, the process is inverted and the future determines the man. We are men because we are the future, and everything that has no future is not a man. End of quote. The United States, Paz said, offers no room for contradictions, ambiguity, or conflict. The nation flies forward swiftly, as if weightless across the land. Trying to stop North Americans moving west, Stephen Austin, the founder of Texas, said over a century earlier, was like trying to stop the Mississippi with a dam of straw. The drive west waxed and waned and burst forward with great passion during key moments. The book, The Edge of the Myth, by Greg Grandin.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Show. Some of you are watching it. Thanks to all of our local affiliates. Thanks to everybody who supports this show. Thanks to the people who support the stations that support this show. We appreciate it. Shout out to my home station, xray.fm. We love you. At least I do. We are now on the air with Thomas Wolfe. He is with the Brennan Center for Justice. Earlier and nearly every day, we talk about democracy. At least we hope to. And when Elizabeth Warren was asked, what's the first thing you do in the first 100 days? She said, well, I'd address anti-corruption. Why? Well, because it will make all our other priorities more possible. It was a deeply wise thing to say. Lawrence Lessig in his TED Talk said, I am not saying that my issue is more important than your issue. In fact, your issue is more important. Healthcare, it's more important. Climate change, more important. Wealth disparity is more important. I'm just saying that dealing with democracy is first, because we can't get to that stuff if we don't get democracy working first. If the organizations in our country who are offering better research and analysis, or are offering research analysis, it is hard to find anybody better, any organization better than the Brennan Center. We hugely appreciate their work. Thomas Wolfe is with us now. Thomas, you are on the air. How you doing? I think Thomas Wolfe is on the air. Thomas, you there?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Go ahead.
All right, great. Well, thanks for having me on, and thanks for the shout out for the work that my colleagues are doing.
Yeah, you got to mute your computer. We're having interference.
Computer's off.
Great. Go ahead. What are you working on?
Well, right now I'm working on anti-gerrymandering work, including work around the Supreme Court.
We're getting you like 3 or 4 times because something else is on. Let's give it another shot if there's something that you can turn off. Let me put you on hold for a sec while you try to mess with that. I'm going to take a quick call and we'll try to get that fixed. Going to Rick. Rick from Lexington, Kentucky. Go ahead.
Thanks for taking my call. The point I would like to make to you is that right now Trump's support is 85% in the Republican Party and 45% across the country. And I just want you to try to help me understand how can he have that much support when me personally, if I say something wrong, correct me.
Yeah.
Trump's a bigot. He's a racist, sexist, homophobe, and he's a liar. How do you raise your hand and say, I'm going to get in that line and still support him?
Yeah.
My senior senator 3 weeks ago, maybe a month, stood on the floor of the Senate and said, we're going to do everything we can do to gerrymander and suppress the vote. So if you're an American, how do you stand in that line and raise your hand and say, I'm a Republican? Yeah. Add to that, now we're going to start this whole fight again for 10 years over health care. And by the way, this is the same party that put kids in cages. So my question to you is, how, out of those 85% in the Republican Party, 45% across the country, which are who? Who are those people?
All right. Well, the first thing I'll say, thank you. Say that again.
I asked you, who are those people?
Yeah, no.
85% or 45% across the country. Who are those people? White people?
They're not. Well, let me take a crack at answering your question, Rick, and then we'll try to get Thomas Wolfe back. The first thing I'll say is I don't want to stand as the apologist, advocate, or even chief explainer of the current right wing, but I don't want to dodge your question. He says that white people, yeah, it's almost entirely white people. It's even a bare majority of all white people. even a somewhat strong majority of middle-aged, non-college educated white men. It's a pretty strong majority of non-college educated white men in general, particularly in certain states in the Union. I think there's 17 states right now where Trump has not only strong support in the Republican Party, but majority support among the entire electorate in those states. So then the other question I heard you ask was how come? Well, this, I think, is one of the most important questions, and I won't give it entire justice right now because I don't want to overly simplify it, but I also don't want to fully dodge it. Several things. Here's where I'll lead. At this point in the show, there are a lot of people for whom their first identity is conservative. Their first identity is Republican. Their first identity in defining that is anti-democratic and anti-liberal. That with the rise of right-wing media, with the rise of right-wing radio, with the rise of Fox News, with the rise of think tanks, with the out in the open, we don't need to call it a conspiracy because it's been out in the open, with the vast mechanism that has been put in place to embolden, to empower, to organize a group of people and create trolling culture. So they think that the definition of being conservative is not merely, I don't know, trying to limit the size of government services. That the definition of being conservative is not merely even just reading one's Ayn Rand. But the definition of conservative is, in fact, trolling, is owning the libs. When that becomes the first principle for a movement, opposing the enemy becomes a first principle, then the person who opposes the enemy, who's the chief troll, the troll in chief, that person gains support among people who share that principle. So I'll give you more thoughts after this, but I want to get back to Thomas Wolfe, who I think we now have. Thomas Wolfe, you there?
Difficulties. Yeah, I'm here. I'm sorry about the difficulties. I've been out on the road, so my normal setup hasn't been geared up. Sorry for your listeners if they had to deal with some kind of gnarly feedback there.
Well, it's nice to have you. What are the key things you're working on right now?
So I've got two things in the hopper. I mean, I think the main thing that folks might be really interested in right now is trying to convince the Supreme Court to finally do something about extreme partisan gerrymandering. We had oral arguments here in D.C. yesterday. I was in the House for that. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about what I saw and what I heard.
Well, I'd ask this, I guess. One of my concerns is that if the only people who care about addressing gerrymandering or gerrymandering, it was Elbridge Gerry, as I understand. I never met the man, rather than Elbridge Gerry. But the of extreme warped redistricting. If the primary concerns happens from a bunch of libs and a bunch of blue states, and blue states do something about it, red states don't, then that could actually be a disadvantage to blue state voters. How is the message of trying to address the redistricting in a sensible way? How is that playing out in different kinds of states, and what do you think might happen next?
Well, the interesting thing, particularly right now for the court, is that there are two maps that are in front of the justices, one from North Carolina, one from Maryland. The North Carolina map was a gerrymander created by Republicans to disadvantage Democrats, but the Maryland map was a map that was created by Democrats to disadvantage Republicans. So the court now has an opportunity to rule in a way that's going to deal setbacks to both parties and make it clear that, you know, if you care about having a representative, accountable democracy like our Constitution requires, you should get behind this particular ruling and listen to what the court has to say.
And where do you think, and so what have been the most recent judicial pronouncements? I knew that a couple years ago, folks were hoping that Justice Kennedy would say that extreme partisan gerrymandering itself was a violation of the Voting Rights Act. I think I have that right, but then he stopped short of that. What's the current state of play?
Yeah, you're exactly right. For 30 years, we've been looking for the court to finally say not just that extreme partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional, which kind of an interesting factoid is that justices from Republican administrations and Democratic administrations in terms of their appointments all agree that extreme partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional. What they haven't been able to figure out yet is what the legal rule should be for figuring out when a map's extreme and when it's not. We thought Justice Kennedy might be a swing vote to finally form a majority for a rule. He stepped down. he was replaced by Justice Kavanaugh. But it seemed like, on the basis of last year's oral arguments, that even Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Alito could be in play because they were troubled by this. And this is important for what's happening now. Justice Kennedy last year said, well, what if you had a law that was passed by a state legislature that said when we draw the maps, we have to disadvantage one party entirely and advantage another? And Justice Alito, the chief, they also thought that there was something constitutionally wrong there. That's exactly what's happened in North Carolina. That's exactly what's happened in Maryland. You've got the Democratic governor, former governor in Maryland, and Republican legislators in North Carolina both saying on the record, the reason why we drew the maps the way we did was to max out the seats for our party and lock out the other party. And in that kind of universe, it might be that there's more than just 4 or 5 votes in play. There could be up to 6.
So as I recall, part of the challenge, you'll need to remind me here because my memory is hazy here. That was it problems of proof, which is how do you know when something is extreme partisanship, or maybe even more so, what's the remedy? How do you make sure that the next map is in fact okay? What would you say is the trickiest legal conundrum that not just partisans would be concerned about?
Yeah, the interesting thing is that I think if your main contact with partisan gerrymandering legal talk is through like magazines, you may get the sense that we're almost like Nick Cage, like in the National Treasure movies. We're trying to find some deep constitutional secret that no one's been able to figure out for hundreds of years. The court actually knows, and I think this term, it's seen that these extreme maps violate like really basic constitutional rules in a lot of different ways. So the question for the justices is not really how does it violate the Constitution. The question for them is a much narrower one, although I'm not going to say it. It's a simpler one, which is how can we do something here, really curb the worst abuses without producing hundreds or thousands of new cases, because we can't handle all of those. So what's the limited way to get in? And that's what plaintiffs need to give them, is not here's why it's unconstitutional. It's here's why it's unconstitutional, and here's how you can get in to make some changes without getting into too much. Yeah, so what's the standard, or what's the answer to that? Try to navigate between that rock and that hard place, that Scylla and Charybdis of, on one hand, doing nothing, on the other hand, having hundreds or thousands of cases. Yeah, I think there's a legal answer here, and then there's a practical answer, and the two of them go together. So the legal answer is to focus on extreme partisan gerrymanders, and this is something that we outlined in our friend of the court brief to the court, where you want to focus on situations where the people drawing the maps had the intent to max out their seats and lock them in for a whole decade. You want to look for cases where that's actually happened. And there are a couple things you can look at to try to suss that out. So, like, normally these kinds of extreme maps don't pop up except when one party controls the whole redistricting process. So if there was compromise or bipartisan compromise in the map, maybe that doesn't get knocked out. And you can also look at things like, how was the map put together? Was one party completely excluded? Was it run entirely by party leadership? If you focus on those things from the area of law, it only puts a few cases or a few maps into play, because that stuff has only happened maybe 6 times with congressional maps this decade, and about a dozen times at state legislative levels this decade. The practical argument is, if the court doesn't set a line now to take out these worst abuses, the worst abuses are going to become the norm next decade, because the facts in North Carolina and Maryland are as terrible as they're ever going to get. And if the court doesn't say this is unconstitutional, then map makers are going to view that as a green light to completely take advantage of the process. So there's a legal answer, and there's a practical need to do something now. And the legal answer is that, and if we can, and thank you to all of our Free Speech TV viewers who are with us on this. What do you think that is? What do you think that standard is? I back in the day was a
law clerk for an Article III judge on the Ninth Circuit, and so there'd be debate. The funny thing to me was that most of the debates, when you'd get somebody else's bench memo, were nits, where you'd respond with well, you put a semicolon in the wrong place. But instead of actually arguing over the key principle, where I wish there would have been much more argument. But what do you think is that key principle? What do you think is a standard that you could imagine? Because it's not going to be, we know it when we see it, and it's not just going to be the words, well, you can't do it real bad. You can do a little bit, but don't do it real bad. What's the way to say don't do it real bad that you think Alito and or Roberts could get behind, that you might predict or advocate for?
Yeah, and maybe Justice Kavanaugh as well. I think that the message that the court should be sending is relatively simple. What they should say is, when one party controls the process and it uses the process to max out its seats and lock them in for a full decade intentionally, that's an unconstitutional extreme partisan gerrymander, and the map should be struck down and redrawn.
So that if you can prove that there was extreme partisan gerrymandering, gets knocked down, and then it's incumbent upon the policymakers to make a better one, and hopefully that one isn't extreme.
Exactly, and it's not like it's that hard to do it.
Yeah. Well, Thomas Wolfe, thank you so much for sticking with us. Thanks so much for calling. We'll be back in just a minute. This is the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jeff Smith. Big week in democracy. Appreciate the Brennan Center's work on trying to make democracy a little bit better, rather than a lot worse. We'll be right back. It's time for Ellen Ratner, Talk Media News, TalkMediaNews.com. Thank you so much, Ellen, for joining us. How you doing?
Thank you so much for having me. Okay, well, the White House sent out something today that said on the Green Deal, the Democrats are yellow. But then, in going after the Green Deal, they never explained why the Democrats were yellow. So we just don't know about that. Also, the vice president met with, and I guess the president did as well, with the acting president of Venezuela's wife, Fabiana. She's either 26 or 28, depending on what you read, and he is only 35 years old. So, this is really who the United States considers the president. And then when President Trump was asked about Russia's interference and Russia placing people on the ground there, they said they know. So we don't really know what is happening in Venezuela in terms of boots on the ground. But we do know that something's probably going on, that's for sure.
The United States did just make another move, against the electrical grid? Was that what just happened earlier this week?
Well, in terms of the electrical grid, the president actually sent he did an emergency, whatever it's called, letter about this. And so that happened this week as well, yes. But we don't really know what that actually means. Now, also on some other fronts, it's very interesting that a law professor by the name of Orrin Kerr wrote out something saying, hey, if the Mueller report was like the report on Clinton, then it should have been made public. And then Monica Lewinsky tweeted, she said it, and she used the F word only. You can imagine. I mean, it's unbelievable what's going on in this world.
Yeah, the dissonance between the expectations of the Ken Starr report and what we were left with in the Ken Starr report, what we're left with here, both the magnitude of what was accused and then what ended up being public versus now, it's a little bit to boggle the mind. What's next, Ellen?
Okay, what's next is the Affordable Care Act. Now, it's very interesting. The Justice Department reversed its position on the legal challenge to the Affordable Care Act. Originally, that was just going to be sections of it. Now it's the entire thing. And the president said that the Republican Party is going to be the party of health care. Okay, well, where is his proposition? You know, you can say anything you want, but if you don't actually respond with a real plan, then it's useless.
Yeah, unless the usefulness is just gaining power, punishing enemies, and rewarding friends. And yet, you're right. I mean, the challenge they've got is the Republican plan. The best Republican idea was, in fact, Romney Care in Massachusetts, which essentially presupposed Obamacare with some important differences, including Medicaid expansion. And so they're kind of boxed in without too many ideas.
Well, that's for sure. Now, also, it's very interesting. Two Republicans, a Republican in the Senate, Rubio, and a representative in the House, a Republican, are saying, well, they support money for the Family Leave Act, but they want to take that money out of people's future Social Security. So what does that do? I mean, you know, okay, yes, you're going to be able to leave and be with your family if you get pregnant or have to take care of your kids if you're a husband or whatever, but you have to take it out of your future Social Security earnings, and that's just ridiculous.
Yeah, we've been in the wake of the big tax cuts, and now they're pushing to cut the programs, want to cut the taxes to make it easier to cut the programs rather than the other way around. Meanwhile, as I understand it, Betsy DeVos wants to zero fund Special Olympics.
Well, she wants to zero fund Special Olympics, and somebody actually did the math and said if President Trump were to give up 5 overseas flights in Air Force One, that would fund the Special Olympics.
Oh, geez.
Would fund everything Betsy DeVos talked about. She was also asked, actually, the Human Rights Campaign, which is the gay lesbian organization, basically had a briefing today, and they said, hey, listen, you know, we've asked Betsy DeVos. We've also asked that, you know, whether kids who are lesbian or gay can be foster kids, et cetera. Nobody's responding. It's really unbelievable.
And I appreciate the focus on the budget. I think a bunch of humanities majors, of which I was also, end up. Well, you know, political science, and rather than math majors and people who nerd out about numbers, I think sometimes avoid the reality that the federal budget is, in fact, our application of our moral choices and our priorities. I really appreciate any other coverage of the budget. Anything else on the...
there's a lot else going on. Okay, Boeing today is very interesting. They are actually having a meeting up in Washington State they're inviting 200 pilots to talk about their briefing, but there's FAA hearings in the Congress today, and they're very upset with Boeing, and they're actually upset with the FAA because they say the FAA should have provided more oversight in terms of this. And so that's very, very interesting to see what's going to actually happen with the FAA and whether the FAA is going to try and take much more of an active role. That's we'll see what happens with that front. Also, Senator Lamar Alexander has proposed a Green Manhattan Project. Obviously, the Manhattan Project was the project that came up with the bomb that won the war in Japan, unfortunately killed a lot of people. But basically, he said, well, they need a Green Manhattan Project. And he said, not only do we have to figure out what's going to happen with green things, we also have to go after countries such as China and India that are actually not doing what they said they were going to do in terms of green.
And what are some of the key elements that we're already aware of what he calls not a Green New Deal, but a Green Manhattan Project?
Well, I'm actually not so sure about that, but I think that it has to do with coal and what's going on with coal in this country, because obviously coal is very cheap. We have a lot of it, and the fact is that coal and gasoline, and I always say to people, people say, well, why do you object? We've got plenty of this. I said, do you think God means in 1 or 2 generations for us to take all of the oil out of the earth? I don't think so.
No, it's a bad sign. If we're living entirely off dead dinosaurs, dead dinosaurs won't last forever. Ellen Ratner, Talk Media News, TalkMediaNews.com, and I hope the goats for the old goat is going well as well.
It is. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks for being with us. This is Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith sitting in. We'll be right back after this.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight
over at ThomHartmann.com, we've got some really cool stuff. A lot of people don't realize that we produce a daily newsletter, and Sue puts we call it Sue's Daily Stack on there, which is literally a link to every story that I've talked about in the show. So all the research is right there. It's free. We don't share or sell our subscriber list. It's there's just it's there. It's there for you, and it's over at ThomHartmann.com. You can sign up for the free newsletter. You also can get my big picture take of the day, which is exclusively over at our website at ThomHartmann.com, as well as links to our videos, the book reports we typically do every day, all this stuff and more. It's all there at ThomHartmann.com. So check it out and sign up for our newsletter. I think you'll really enjoy it and appreciate it and find a lot of value there. We put a lot of work into this stuff, and you'll find it all right there on our website at ThomHartmann.com. And be sure to check out the newsletter and sign up for it. It's great. Our book for the Thom Hartmann Book Club today is by Lanny Guinier. It's The Tyranny of the Majority, Fundamental Fairness in Representative Democracy. This is from the first chapter, The Tyranny of the Majority. I've always wanted to be a civil rights lawyer, she writes. This lifelong ambition is based on a deep-seated commitment to democratic fair play, to playing by the rules as long as the rules are fair. When the rules seem unfair, I have worked to change them, not subvert them. When I was 8 years old, I was a Brownie. I was especially proud of my uniform, which represented a commitment to good citizenship and good deeds. But one day, when my Brownie group staged a hat-making contest, I realized that uniforms are only as honorable as the people who wear them. The contest was rigged. The winner was assisted by her milliner mother, who actually made the winning entry in full view of all the participants. At the time, I was too young to be able to change the rules, but I was old enough to resign, which I promptly did. To me, fair play means that the rules encourage everyone to play. They should reward those who win, but they must be acceptable to those who lose. The central theme of my academic writing is that not all rules lead to elemental fair play. Some even commonplace rules work against it. The professional milliner competing with amateur brownies stands as an example of rules that are patently rigged or patently subverted. Yet sometimes, even when rules are perfectly fair in form, they serve in practice to exclude particular groups from meaningful participation. When they don't encourage everyone to play, or when, over the long haul, they do not make the losers feel as good about the outcome as the winners, they can seem as unfair as the milliner who makes the winning hat for her daughter. Sometimes, too, we construct rules that force us to be divided into winners and losers when we might have otherwise joined together. This idea was cogently expressed by my son Nicholas when he was 4 years old, far exceeding the thoughtfulness of his mother when she was an 8-year-old brownie. While I was writing one of my Law Journal articles, Nicholas and I had a conversation about voting prompted by a Sesame Street magazine exercise. The magazine pictured 6 children. 4 children had raised their hands because they wanted to play tag. 2 had their hands down because they wanted to play hide and seek. The magazine asked its readers to count the number of children whose hands were raised and then decide what game the children would play. Nicholas quite realistically replied, "They'll play both. First they'll play tag, then they'll play hide and seek." Despite the magazine's rules, he was right. To children, it's natural to take turns. The winner may get to play first or more often, but even the loser gets something. His was a positive sum solution that many adult rule makers ignore. The traditional answer to the magazine's problem would have been a zero-sum solution. The children, all the children, will play tag and only tag. As a zero-sum solution, everything is seen in terms of I win, you lose. The conventional answer relies on winner-take-all majority rule, in which the tag players, as the majority, win the right to decide for all the children what game to play. The hide-and-seek preference becomes irrelevant. The numerically more powerful majority choice simply subsumes minority preferences. In the conventional case, the majority that rules gains all the power, and the minority that loses gets none. For example, 2 years ago, Brother Rice High School in Chicago held 2 senior proms. It was not planned that way. The prom committee at Brother Rice, a boys' Catholic high school, expected just 1 prom when it hired a disc jockey, picked a rock band, and selected music for the prom by consulting student preferences. Each senior was asked to list his 3 favorite songs, and the band would play the songs that appeared most frequently on the lists. Seems attractively democratic. But Brother Rice is predominantly white, and the prom committee was all white. And that's how they got 2 proms. The black seniors at Brother Rice felt so shut out by the democratic process that they organized their own prom. As one black student put it, for every vote we had, there were 8 votes for what they wanted. With us being in the minority, we were always outvoted. It's as if we don't count. Some embittered white seniors saw things differently. They complained that the black students should have gone along with the majority. The majority makes the decision, they said. That's the way things work. In a way, both groups were right. From the white students' perspective, this was ordinary decision-making. To the black students, majority rule sent the message, we don't count, is the way it works for minorities. In a racially divided system, majority rule may be perceived as majority tyranny. That's a large claim, and I don't rest my case for it solely on the actions of the prom committee in one Chicago high school. To expand the range of the argument, I first consider the ideal of majority rule itself, particularly as reflected in the writings of James Madison and other founding members of our republic. These early Democrats explored the relationship between majority rule and democracy. James Madison warned, if a majority be united by a common interest, the rights of the minority will be insecure. The tyranny of the majority, according to Madison, requires safeguards to protect, quote, one part of the society against the injustice of the other part, end quote. For Madison, majority tyranny represented the great danger to our early constitutional democracy. Although the American Revolution was fought against the tyranny of the British monarch, it soon became clear there was another tyranny to be avoided, the accumulation of all powers in the same hands. Madison warned whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. As another columnist suggested in papers published in Philadelphia, we've been so long habituated to a jealousy of tyranny from monarchy and aristocracy that we have yet to learn the dangers of it from democracy. Despotism had to be opposed, whether it came from kings, lords, or the people. Laniganier's Tyranny of the Majority.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program. I'm Jeff. Thanks for listening. Thanks for joining. Thanks for tweeting. You can call us at 202-808-9925. It's 202-808-9925. You can also tweet at us at Thom Hartmann, or tweet at me at Jefferson D. Smith. Got a couple tweets in. Gray says, it's true, Democrats are the best party. They're not trying to rig elections and block people from voting. They're not un-American Putin puppets wearing T-shirts. I'd rather be Russian than a Democrat. Republicans are Nazis, period. That's what Grace had to say. Lisa had to say, Big Valley popcorn. Appreciate that one, Lisa. Eco Peace Christian wanted to give a shout out to Joe Biden. Joe Biden today apologizing about Anita Hill. Some speculating that that is a precursor to him announcing for the presidency, thinking that the hearing that he ran in the Anita Hill accusations and the confirmation of Clarence Thomas could be one of the larger barriers to him winning the Democratic primary. Andy Stanley said something nice and said it would be unfair for him to expect that he'd appreciate the creeping Trumpian corruption absorbing both the White House and the DOJ. Also, Bob, I think from yesterday, or excuse me, it's Bab, or it might have just been hearing the show from yesterday, who said Dems playing hardball. I'd asked, well, what does hardball look like? Democrats playing hardball looks like Pelosi saying no vote on the border wall bill until Mexico pays for it, rather than meekly giving him the win. It looks like a million women march in Selma, not San Francisco. It looks like freshman AOC, Omar, Tlaib, and Presley. Thank you, Bab, for texting in. Let's take a couple calls. I made a promise earlier that I want to keep, and I want to do a couple corrections. So one correction, somebody called in at X-Ray and said, how dare he say weed instead of cannabis? I got nothing against it. In fact, when I was laid up almost exactly a year ago today, if it hadn't been for easily available cannabis, I might have in fact gotten hooked on opioids. I was prescribed opioids because I was in bed for a month with a dislodged pubic symphysis. And luckily, on the air, we had been covering the opioid crisis. and I had and I had learned that you could, as few as 13 days, you could get hooked on opioids. And I was prescribed Percocet, and I was taking the Percocet. It's about on the 13th day, I was like, you know what? I should pause today. I shouldn't take it today. And what happened? I got withdrawal symptoms. I got headache. I got pains and aches and bad feelings and depression that wasn't just in my pubic symphysis, which I didn't know what it was until I heard it. And luckily, cannabis wasn't the same thing as the Percocet. It did a different thing, but it helped me make it through. And now I have great sympathy and empathy for people who become hooked on opioids, because I think I was probably just a few days away. So anyway, shout out to the person who wants to make sure that when I say weed, I clarify and say cannabis. Also got a text in the clarifying cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias. So I won't get this exactly right, but I'll offer the best I can. So confirmation bias is when you absorb the facts that confirm what you already thought and set aside the facts that don't. Cognitive dissonance is when you have two conflicting beliefs or two conflicting cognitions, and you do some twisting to make sure that they somehow jibe, or when you act in accordance with some twisted understanding, some twisted sense of those cognitions. So appreciate that text in. And I, roughly speaking, understand the difference, but want to make sure that if we're trying to help people understand more, that we in fact do that. Another promise I kept. One of our callers was saying, well, we don't, and this is an important debate. Well, we shouldn't go too hard after the Russians, because that merely cloaks what's really happening in the world and makes it more likely that we empower the military state, and could even lead us to war. That vilifying Vladimir Putin is tantamount to a run-up, or could be a justification for funding the war machine, which could beget, in fact, not only a funded war machine that is unused, but what could even be worse than that is a used war machine in places where it should not have been used. And therefore, his argument was, well, support whoever the candidate, support the candidate who's outside the establishment, and that definition is essentially, or at least coincides with, the candidate who is the more pro-Russian. Give me my understanding. Let me offer my understanding. I try to avoid a binary understanding of stuff. It is simplistic and too often false. And I don't think that there is a binary control of the universe anymore since the end of the Cold War. Roughly speaking, end of roughly the Coldish War. So what is the world power argument right now? Well, there is some chaos on the world stage. If you watch Game of Thrones, then you know that Littlefinger says that chaos is a ladder. So who is trying to ascend that ladder? Well, the chaos is there was a Western Alliance. That Western Alliance had an organizing principle of fighting the forces of fascism and totalitarian communist Russia. It was resisting those things. Its principal, most obvious organizing place was NATO. But this Western Alliance, which was not only a military alliance, shared a rough understanding of being capitalist democracies. And there was an almost consensus. You had the article written, The End of History. Fukuyama, is that who wrote End of History? Saying, okay, we figured it out. The arc of history has bent, and it's landed in its final resting place, and its final resting place is going to be the capitalist democracy. There are threats to that consensus. Some is that consensus did not address nearly sufficiently racism and misogyny, although it made some significant strides in addressing racism and misogyny. It really has not sufficiently addressed wealth disparities. In fact, those have gotten worse. So from the left, the critique of that consensus, particularly socialist parties in Europe, have said, hey, we can't trust this Western Alliance consensus enough because look at what's happening to the gap between the rich and poor. Look what's happening with consolidation of wealth with large international financial institutions. It hasn't dealt with the climate challenge. It's related to too much power. It hasn't related to making sure that consolidated corporate power doesn't, in fact, subvert the democratic side of the capitalist democracy coalition. The other challenge, the resistance from the right, and this might be where chaos is a ladder, is that it is not respecting white supremacy enough, so says Steve Bannon. And that the argument that he has made even recently, he said, Steve Bannon recently had comments, well, the Mueller investigation was, and all of the anti-Trump sentiment, and anti-Putin sentiment, has been in the way of us building a Judeo-Christian coalition in the world. And I want to get back to that. The other, or another challenge that I see, one of the reasons why the Western Alliance is fraying, I said this yesterday, but I only said it very briefly, is very practically speaking the dying of World War II veterans. That if you look at the timing of the Civil War happened about 80 years after the Revolutionary War. It happened just after essentially all of the Revolutionary War veterans had died. When the collective memory, the collective decision to be stronger together than we are apart as a nation, well, those people had passed away. The memory had gone away, and therefore there was a war betwixt the states. There was a civil war. We fought World War II. We had a consensus against fascism. We had a consensus around some degree of democracy. That consensus is fraying. I think we have to establish that consensus, reestablish it. We'll be back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program. The call-in number is 202-808-9925. Rick, you are on the air on Free Speech TV. Thank you so much, and you win the Most Patient Listener Award. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, is this me?
This is you, Quincy, Massachusetts.
Yes, there you go. Hi. Yeah, I just remember Puppy Bush's New World Order, and that just seems like it's manifesting itself with Barr, et cetera, and everybody else, any Nixonian person. It's coming into fruition right now, and I just wanted to get my voice out in dissent because it seems like that's the New World Order. Corporate, CIA, and China, I guess, the deal Nixon made with China, and here comes Donald.
Appreciate, Rick. Appreciate your call. Thanks for listening. Going to Gene from Myerstown, Pennsylvania. Go ahead, Gene.
Hi, Jeff. You're doing a good job.
Thanks, man.
I have a book that I read, still stays in my mind. This must have been from the 80s. William Greider, is it Greider? He wrote a book called "Who Will Tell the People?"
Yeah, I think it's Greider. In fact, I think I was assigned that book in political science class. I think it was Will Greider.
Yeah. He was a progressive before it was cool.
Yeah.
But that's my question. Who will tell the middle class, the working class, who are working 2 or 3 jobs, haven't had a raise for decades, have maybe $300 or $400 for an emergency, and maybe not even that the Republicans are not on their side.
Yep.
Even though they keep voting for them again and again. You know, I thought after George W. Bush we wouldn't see a Republican for decades, you know. But I'm wrong. So who's going to tell them? That the mainstream cable media is not going to tell them because you just don't hear it that straight out, that the Republican message for decades now since Reagan is cut taxes for the rich, gut regulations, and have a war if you can possibly manage it to boost your popularity. And that's it.
Yep. And
nothing about helping the working people.
Yep. And this is why we do the show, right? And this is why the show needs to get bigger. And this is why we need to generate more purpose-driven media. This is why I so appreciate you calling in, listening. Is why I so appreciate each and every caller and each and every watcher on Free Speech TV, and everybody becomes a member of Free Speech TV, and everybody who downloads the X-Ray.fm app and has it on their phone, and everybody who supports their own purpose-driven radio station in their town, because somebody's got to tell the people, and Greider was right. I think I may have said I read in law school. That's not true. It was college. In fact, it came out when I was in college. And that essential question, and I hinted at this earlier. I nodded at it earlier, but the growth of right-wing media happened in significant part because of AM radio. AM radio presupposed Fox News. It demonstrated that there was a market there that could be pitched to Rupert Murdoch by Barry Diller to say, hey, you could see what Limbaugh's done? You could do this on TV. And people will be able to see it. You get people who are telegenic and feed them anything. Who will tell the people indeed? Well, we'll do our best, and we'll take your help as much as we can get it. Carter was right. Carter was right. He was right about a bunch of stuff. He was right about climate change. He was also right about this. Now, I'm saying that one of the things that's happening in the world right now, and this is the big stuff. This is the big stuff. It's not, oh, what happened today, story, that stuff's important. This is the big, big stuff. What is the global argument right now? If we're not in Fukuyama's end of history, we've not just landed in a final resting place because we know that Russian kleptocracy and China, more state-controlled capitalism, not exactly capitalism, but not a democracy, are big question marks to this idea that we've identified the ideal type of the way to govern a country. That subversion of democracy by capitalist structures, the falling out of balance between individualism and collectivism, demonstrated by vast wealth disparities, demonstrated by fires and floods, every fire and flood season, and starting to get fires and floods outside, during flood and fire season instead of the way it had been for a long time. That there is a major argument. And if we think simplistically, oh, this is about some, dirty deal between one government and another government, no, understand, Bannon's idea is broader than that. It is not merely about like getting some government's help to help with one little election. And he even said it. It is about trying to unite Judeo-Christian countries around the fact that they are Judeo-Christian countries. That the new organizing principle should not be the Western Alliance, the post-World War II world order, but instead, it should be based on race and religion. That is the uniting principle. And those are powerful ideas. Race and religion can bring people together and very much divide you from people with different race and different ideas, particularly if those are used as wedges. If we're going to think big picture, if we're going to try to address the big stuff, if we're going to try to not just be a cat chasing a laser beam, what's our big idea? And I don't mean R as some political party or some subset of some political movement. I just mean people are trying to make the world a little bit better rather than a lot worse. What's the winning idea that is worth getting behind? Well, certainly we'll take your thoughts on it. The call-in number is 202-808-9925. But I say Carter was right. I think it's democracy. The Kissinger idea is that international relations should be based on national interests, economic interests and military interests. Carter's idea was, no, we need to, interests matter, but we need to have some common interest, and that common interest was we should acknowledge and reward international players based on their support for democracy and human rights and civil rights. We should have an organizing idea that is humans should be in charge, and humans should be in charge for the benefit of humanity, and that democracy is something that we should work for. Carter was called a Pollyanna. His head was in the clouds. His feet were not sufficiently on the ground. But he was right. That is the organizing principle. Because what else you got? If it's just a military alliance against Russia, that's insufficient. I don't agree that we should support whoever candidate is friendliest with Russia, because my own view of Russia is that they might be down for a Judeo-Christian unity movement. White Christian people around the world get together to try to maintain supremacy over people who aren't Christians, who aren't white, or aren't Jewish, or aren't Christians, and aren't white. But I think what really the joke is, just support the kleptocratic regime. And I don't think the kleptocratic regime should either be. I don't think that some just entrenched wealth favor trading, which has also been on the rise, that shouldn't be the organizing order. And if we don't have one, it will be, if it isn't already. So this is why I keep coming back to the first principle of democracy. This is why why we appreciated the call with the Brennan Center, so we can start with what Lawrence Lessig said, what Elizabeth Warren said is, we're not saying it's the most important, it's just first. Let's get that figured out. Tom from St. Paul, Minnesota, wants to either pile on or push back. Go ahead, Tom.
No, Jefferson. Yeah, I wanted to challenge you on the term you used on capitalist democracy. That's the term you used, saying, NATO was to support that versus the totalitarian side of fascism and what you call totalitarian communism. And the reason I want to challenge you on this,
sure,
the word capitalist democracy promotes confusion, since the conservatives want to believe that freedom comes from capitalism, and of course the liberals believe freedom comes from democracy. And a good book by Kevin Phillips, a former Republican, called Wealth and Democracy, in his afterword, he talks about the dynamic tension between democracy and capitalism, whereas democracy promotes distribution and capitalism promotes concentration. So there's always this dynamic tension. And he says, which is subservient to which? Is democracy subservient to capitalism, or vice versa, right?
Yep.
And just sort of on a tangent, they kept asking, what's his name, Hickenlooper, do you believe in capitalism? And no one knows how to answer that question, right?
Right.
And I wish they would just say, well, first of all, what kind? That's the answer. What kind of capitalism, regulated or unregulated? And then they should just segue into, I believe in democracy, since that is not supposed to be subservient to capitalism. So that term capitalist democracy is too confusing.
It is. So mostly what I want to do is not only agree, but say huzzah, huzzah, and very much appreciate the call. I don't think, I'm not advocating for, I mean, it was intentional. These things were, I have so much to say, that I think the idea that capitalism is there to promote freedom is not just an overstatement, a misstatement. But how I would answer the Hickenlooper question is, I believe that capitalism should be to the service of human beings, to the service of democracy, not the other way around. And that our economic system should be to the service of how we're stronger together than we are apart. Not that we should all be in the service merely of our economic system. But I agree that part of the challenge with the capitalist democracy landing point is those things are in some tension. How we resolve that tension is exactly where I think we are in the world. We have to resolve that. I want to talk more with you. We got to go to break. We'll be back. You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jeff. That was Tom. A different Tom.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
This is Thom Hartmann Show, 202-808-9925. If you call in, you'll get heard. We're going to have a speed round.
Guns for Hire, how the CIA and U.S. Army recruit mercenaries for white Rhodesia. It's a historical reprint of what appears to be a 1979 pamphlet, basically. This is from the introduction. It does have an ISBN number. It is available in book sources. In Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, actually this must have been published post-1980 because they're referencing Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, 270,000 white settlers, mostly immigrated since World War II, controlled the government and economy, ruling over the 7 million black Africans. The Zimbabweans cannot vote. They have been forced off the bulk of the arable land, and they have no democratic rights whatsoever. All labor performance in Zimbabwe is black labor, and it is intensely exploited, often at less than subsistence wages. Zimbabweans have been fighting European invaders since the early 17th century. Since the 1890s, they have been directly ruled by Europeans, at first in the form of a private British corporation, the British South Africa Company. Since 1923, direct political rule has been in the hands of the white settlers, currently led by Ian Smith and his fascist Rhodesian Front Party. It's important to note that the white settlers were originally given this direct local power as a, quote, self-governing colony of the British government, thereby creating a master-caretaker relationship. During these past 80-odd years, Western imperialism, the multinational corporations of the United States, Britain, and South Africa, has extracted huge profits from the exploited and oppressed Zimbabwean population via the subsidiaries of the Anglo-Americans, Lonrho, Amax, AMAX, Union Carbide, Mobil, ITT, and other corporations. They fully intend to continue doing so as long as they can. The white settler minority has been rewarded for their violent subjugation of the Zimbabwean people with perhaps the highest national standard of living in the world. Sir Roy Walensky, the former Prime Minister of the Central African Federation, which included what is now Rhodesia, once said, "This man Smith has an appeal. It's the appeal of an easy life. For $6,000 a year, you can have 5 servants, a swimming pool, and a lot." Beginning during the early 1960s, however, the Zimbabwean nationalist forces under the leadership of the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, evolved the strategy of guerrilla war to liberate their people and land. It is proving to be very successful. There are 20,000 guerrillas in base camps in Tanzania and Mozambique, over 3,000 in Zimbabwe itself, and this number is continually rising. In a meeting between Stephen Solars, a U.S. congressman, and the ZANU guerrilla leaders, they were reported to reject the possibility of enlisting the assistance of Cuban or other foreign troops, declaring that if we cannot liberate ourselves, we do not deserve to be liberated. Despite Western propaganda to the effect that the U.S. and British only wish to avoid a bloodshed in Rhodesia, don't forget the Zimbabweans have been bleeding for almost a century, their real fear is that the liberation struggle will win. With this victory in sight, it is not surprising that the counterattack by the Smith regime has become more vicious and brutal. Actually, this must have been published pre-1980, because this is when Smith was still in power in Rhodesia. More than 250,000 rural Zimbabweans have been forced into concentration camps. Terrorist raids have been conducted against Zimbabwean refugees in Mozambique. Dusk to dawn shoot-on-sight curfews have been instituted and enforced in the border areas. And escalating counterinsurgency attacks have been launched against the military arm of the liberation struggle, the Zimbabwean People's Army, ZIPA. It is crucial for Westerners to understand that the Smith regime has not stood alone in this barbaric campaign. This pamphlet documents the critically important element in U.S. imperialism's support for the Smith regime, white mercenary reinforcements for the fascist Rhodesian, quote, security forces. This flow of U.S. mercenaries to prop up white Rhodesia is an important, though secret, part of U.S. imperialism's strategy for Africa. The U.S. has massive investments in southern Africa. Zimbabwe alone supplies the bulk of high-grade chrome ore used in the U.S. for jet engines and other advanced technological items. Coal, copper, and other minerals are ripped out of Zimbabwe for U.S. industry. Mobil Oil, Texaco, Hertz Rent-A-Cars, Holiday Inns, and many other U.S. corporations operate illegally in Rhodesia through foreign subsidiaries. More important still is South Africa, the fortress of U.S. interests in Africa, where $1.5 billion is invested by GM, IBM, Ford, and other giant multinational corporations. The liberation of Zimbabwe would, for the first time, penetrate the buffer zone of satellite countries protecting the borders of South Africa. South African guerrilla fighters, who are already training by the thousands in camps in Tanzania and Zambia, would have direct access to re-enter their land and accelerate the liberation struggle. Knowing that the stakes are high, U.S. imperialism has worked to strengthen the white supremacist outposts in Africa, although at times this had to be done covertly. In 1970, the Nixon White House approved Henry Kissinger's Operation Tar Baby strategy, based on Option 2 of the Secret National Security Study Memorandum No. 39. This strategy essentially called for covert military assistance, including direct exchanges, so that South African troops could be trained in the U.S. in specialized tactics and weapons. This would be done while the U.S. tried to convince Africans that it was on their side. This is from the pamphlet number 39, that Kissinger memorandum. We would maintain public opposition to racial oppression, but relax political isolation and economic restrictions without openly taking a position undermining the United Kingdom and the UN on Rhodesia. We would be more flexible in our attitudes toward the Smith regime. And it goes on from there. Guns for hire.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
I want to re-up my call for the Hartmann-Hannity decathlon, where we take a random sample of Hannity listeners and a random sample of Hartmann listeners and put them through a set of intellectual challenges, of awareness and factual quizzes. Yesterday it was suggested there should be one of spotting a country on the map. I called that the map look. There's also the demographic data challenge. Guess what percentage of people in the country, for instance, is Muslim. There's also the policy quiz. Not like what do you believe in, but what do you believe to be true? How many people have died from gun violence by white male Americans versus somebody that somebody might characterize as a Muslim terrorist? And I'm reminded that I want this decathlon by the intelligence of our listeners and the information of our listeners. Sometimes because they agree with me, sometimes because they correct me. Thank you to Patricia. I don't want to mispronounce your name, or if I do, I want to do it twice. Oil is from compressed, heated, and fossilized algae. Coal is compressed, heated, ancient plant material. I think I said it was dinosaurs. I think it's funnier to say it's dinosaurs, but it's not as accurate. And I appreciate a community that advocates for accuracy. Thank you also to our call from Kevin Phillips recommending the book Wealth and Democracy. I want to belabor that just for a moment. I do think that's the fight. And I haven't yet designed all of the rhetorical architecture for this. I haven't found all the words. But I do think that the battle right now, we think of it as right versus left. I think the battle right now is essentially concentrated capital versus democracy. That is the tension. That post-World War II, we had landed in a place, and also importantly, during the FDR administration and post economic collapse, post Great Depression, that we had been in a place of some degree of balance, and even during regulatory eras where it was clear that our capitalist structure, that our economic system was in the service of, or should be controlled by, or should be second to small d democratic decisions. And any system you pick is going to have a host of imperfections, and we had a host of imperfections, but we are losing that consensus. And that what the Koch brothers thing is trying to say that entrenched property, that wealth, and this goes back to John C. Calhoun, who was making that argument that property should trump democracy. And the property John C. Calhoun was talking about was owning human beings, was being the principal theologian in favor of slavery. And the argument right now is democracy versus, should property, and the ownership of property, including through the generations and the protection of inheritance, should that be the thing that makes all decisions? Or should we get together and make decisions together about the most important things need to happen? This is the same debate, this is the same tension that's been happening since the Magna Carta. And it's clear who the good guys are. It's clear who the good people are. Good people are, hey, let's have an economic system that works, and let's make sure it's working for people rather than only the other way around. We're going to have a speed round. Let's take a couple of the callers right now. Let's go to Elaine from KBCCS from Seattle, Washington. I've heard wonderful things about KBCCS. I said the letters too many times. Go ahead, Elaine.
Oh, thanks. It is a great station. So, question for you. Am I just hopelessly naive, or is there a chance in the next election that we could perhaps have a Democratic president elected and a Democratic Congress overwhelmingly, as well as the Senate, so that possibly, just possibly, all the things that have been happening might be, changed for the good?
Yes, there's a chance. There's absolutely a chance.
Okay.
And except I want to modify a little bit. If we think that elections save everything, I think we misunderstand it, because they'll still be within the same media context. It didn't take long for somebody who had both the capacity and even the demonstrated capacity to be a historically popular president to have Fox News and the then sort of invented Tea Party, the teabaggers, they called themselves the teabaggers. I don't very easily want to give them the important parts of the American story. Ended up pivoting and trying to get back to trying to get half the country to hate Barack Obama. So I think that we do have to transform the media, and we do have to transform election rules, and we do have to transform power at the local level. We've got to do a lot of other stuff other than win one election. And we've got to be girding ourselves for decades, not only months. But yes, there is a chance that not only to win the presidency, but the Senate. In fact, Susan Collins is up. New Mexico, Udall is not running again, but Democrats now have demonstrated an ability to win in New Mexico. Mitch McConnell is not necessarily Teflon. Kentucky, if you can boost African American voter turnout in Kentucky, it is not, history is not destiny. That even Kentucky could be in play. So I think that that if we're trying to embrace the Stockdale paradox, being brutally honest about what we're facing, we're not going to get this all done in 2 years, we're not going to get this all done in 4 years, but also having elements of optimism, 2020 is an opportunity.
Okay. All right. Thanks for taking my call.
Well, thanks for calling in. Let's hear from Kim, serious. I think that's how you're listening, not your state of mind, from Detroit, Michigan.
No, I'm very serious.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah, listen, I think democracy can work. If you look at the 60s and the 70s, when the unions had much more power, they were able to extract a comfortable living wage for their members. But after that, the corporation went to work, and we have the imbalance that we have now. So if we have that balance between unionism and corporate America minus the racism, I think democracy could work for America.
Amen. Amen. And by the way, it has. There have been multiple times. We shouldn't just beat ourselves up. I mean, we have done some remarkable things in bending the arc of history towards justice, in solving problems, in building wonderful things, in answering critical questions, and I think we can again. And some of it, by the way, doesn't require, as you've mentioned, really tricky innovation or invention of stuff we haven't already figured out. Like, for instance, if we just re-strengthened some of the union organizing rules and made it not quite as profitable to bust a union in a large company. The last case I did actually was a small labor case as a lawyer, and it was a guy who got fired by Best Buy. And the circumstances was that a friend of his, who he knew in Democratic Party circles and who was a union organizer, said while he was in line buying something at the Best Buy, said, you ought to organize a union up in here. And there was a little bit joking back and forth. Within 48 hours, he was put, I think 24 hours, he was put on administrative leave. And by the end of the week, he was fired. And we won the case. What we realized, because it was clear facts, but what we realized was that the remedies were really thin. He got reinstatement, which doesn't mean he gets to keep his job. It means he gets a little bit of money, but it's only a little bit of money. And if Best Buy had to do that, couple times a year around the country, spend a few handful $1,000s of each time, plus hire their lawyer to do it, that's vastly cheaper than having to concede on some wages and benefits in a union contract. So right now, the incentive structure for businesses is to beat back unions. But I want to say something else, because in a information economy where not everything is organized by large industrial corporation, and if we're trying to push for not everything organized by large corporations generally, then I also want to throw in other ownership structures, co-ops, et cetera, employee-owned businesses. The union was a necessary response to, growth to, many trends, including the rise of industrialization and the control of large organizations. If we also want there to be small organizations or mid-sized organizations, some of those can be unionized, but also want to poke at new ownership strategies. So you don't just have mega ownership with a little bit better contracts, but also figuring out how we manage ownership. Wow, those are big thoughts. I got to take a breath. Hoo-wee. This is a hoo-wee day. Hoo-wee today. Corky, Rochester, go ahead.
Yeah, fascism hates unions. And immigration is a threat to Donald Trump because they can recognize fascism right in the very beginning. So he wants to keep those people from Venezuela and Mexico from coming to the U.S. because they know what fascism is.
Yeah, it's interesting, the Venezuela thing. Here's my other. You want some more on the Hui Day? All right. If this is a Hui Day, we just came up with that today. I've been thinking about this question of global power, how global power is working, and if one follows along with me on my hypothesis that the post-World War II consensus is fraying, and that's a lot of what this is about. That's a lot of what the Putin stuff's about. That's a lot of what the Bannon stuff's about. That's a lot of what the Sebastian Gorka stuff is about. It's a lot of what the Stephen Miller stuff is about, is trying to capitalize on the fraying post-World War II consensus, and what I would characterize as some of the best parts of it. That what do we put in its place, and what do we prioritize, and who could find opportunity? Well, somebody who's been finding opportunity for a long time is, in fact, fossil fuel businesses. And if you connect the dots on American foreign policy, it doesn't take a conspiracy theorist of the highest order to be able to connect the dots around, I don't know, who was the American Secretary of State until not too long ago? What's the biggest source of Russian money? And what is Venezuela doing that they don't like? Is it really the civil rights part? Or is it also the ownership of oil resources part? This is Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jeff.
To Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We're going to finish up with a speed round. 202-808-9925, 202-808-9925. John from WBAI in Bedford, New York. Go ahead.
Hi there. Yes, thanks. The public is so overwhelmed with misleading, false, and partially true, perhaps, information. We really need to rein that in by treating or anything that basically goes into the realm of fraudulent communications no different than if you lied to the insurance company about how your house burned down or what happened to your car in a wreck.
Yeah.
We could basically say that if it's not evidence-based, whether it's a media company, a politician, a corporation, a PR company, that if they put anything out there, there's no evidence to support, it's a crime, it's fraud. And that's going on, it's rampant. The public, cannot sift through the mountains of information to know what's legitimate. And for the common sense of the people to work, we have to rein in and separate fact from fiction.
How do you balance that with freedom of speech? It's maybe too simplistic a question, but if that were the pushback, what would be your response?
Speech is not the right to mislead and damage the public.
So there would be
shouting of fire in a theater. That's the classic example.
Yeah,
right?
That's a classic example of a little bit different thing. That's when speech moves into conduct. When speech has physical harm or creates action rather than just being bad speech. But I do think it's really interesting. So that could be and this is something that Donald Trump actually pushed for, is a softening of New York Times v. Sullivan to say that there should be a stricter standard than I think under New York Times v. Sullivan, I think it's recklessness or knowing or knowing false statements, but softening that standard, making it easier to go after a newspaper, go after Facebook, go after an individual commentator for a false statement, for slander and libel, and do you not worry? And I think your point is important, but do you not worry at least a little bit that could be that law enforcement could use that to quell speech that was, well, you didn't have enough evidence when you were talking badly about the current president of the United States?
Yes, I don't worry because what I'm talking about is different.
Go ahead.
This isn't about slander and libel. This is about intentional fraud.
Yeah.
And putting something out there that can hurt people physically, cause damage to the public, has great impact on financial decisions, leads us into wars that are completely false. There's no basis. Going back to the Vietnam War, at least the second war in Iraq and probably the first two, these are catastrophic frauds pulled over on the American people. And, it's not about what Trump said at all. This is about a citizen-powered transformation of how the public is informed and what is legitimate public communications, because we're drowning in a sea of lies and half-truths.
So I think, and we got about 10 seconds, so I think what you're saying is not soften, I think you just said, you don't want to soften slander or libel, but rather make it when there is clear slander or libel, done by some organization potentially, that could be not only a civil action, but there could be criminal action.
PR companies are largely at fault. It's mainly PR companies that figure out these clever ways to mislead the public.
John, thank you very much. We'll be right back. Hey, everybody. I'm Jeff, and we are in the final push. Good stuff always happens in the final push. We appreciate you for doing the whole push. It's a hooey day. And we had not one, not two, but 3 words, concept, or phrases of the day. 1 word, 1 phrase, 1 concept, maybe 3 concepts. I'll leave that to you. You decide. Right now, this show is about you. Let's hear from George. George from WBAI from Hazlet, New Jersey. Go ahead. You know that New Jersey. Do you know that New Jersey is about the same size as Israel in terms of geography and population?
Is it really the same?
About the
wow,
same.
Density too, huh?
From what I understand, I haven't been to Israel, so
that's not the occupied territory.
It's a good question. It could get muddled. It could get muddled quickly.
Quickly, yes.
Yeah.
Woo-wee, you are on fire today like a possessed man. Did you get your jinx in today or something?
I don't know, man. I think it's because I haven't slept enough, and so I go on second wind, and the second wind relies. I don't know. It just makes the mind go differently. But go ahead. Right. I think you wanted to ask about capitalism.
Yeah, we were talking about. I was just thinking about how we are basically preying on one another with working for the man, that kind of thing, which sounds cliche and everything, but it is true. And as the pyramid, you have to keep control of the pyramid, but the power is being funneled to a few because we all pay a toll, to these people and it goes up and up, and the power goes up. So you were talking about, everything you were just talking about related to some guy having more power that owns the media, then he owns the military, he owns this, he owns that.
Yep.
Doesn't pay taxes. He get out of jail free cards. You know what I mean? Goes to school free cards. Kids get whatever. You know what I mean? And it
snowballs. You get more power, and then you're able to enact rules that reward you further, that put you in a better position to get more power. And that is why. Heck, that's even why Thomas Jefferson said every once in a while you need to have a revolution. Was I think because power accretes, because power has the ability to help itself accrete.
Yeah, but I was looking the John Lennon thing, the Dreamer thing, evolution, where you stop doing the same revolution, because this same thing, it keeps coming around. But now it's getting big, where when they fight this time, all bets are off, and you got loonies at the button. You got Putin and Trump and a couple other crackpots, and everybody's fighting over the last bit of oil that's choking us to death. And we're all sitting here worried about our piece of cheese as the ship we're on is sinking. So, but it's great talking. Everybody says it's just a, great history, great time to be alive, or the last time to be alive for mankind. I don't know what they're saying, but the pyramid scheme, I think, has to be broken because, like I said, it funnels up and then the power just goes away. There's no democracy left. There's no nothing.
George, that's what I think we're facing. That I think that I do think that's an inflection point in history. I thought so before Barack Obama was elected. In fact, my case in 2004 was that I was not as focused on the presidential race. But I thought that Barack Obama got elected too early. I voted for the guy, and I'll explain what I mean, but that there was not yet the apparatus built. There were not yet. I view Barack Obama a little bit like Woodrow Wilson, and I don't mean to compare them on policy, and I certainly don't mean to compare them in terms of race. And by that, I don't mean what race they were, but how racist they were. Woodrow Wilson seemed pretty clear was a racist. But in terms of the time in history, they came into power. That Woodrow Wilson came into power when we were pivoting from an agrarian age with economic and social power built around the working farm, where the greatest wealth in the United States had in fact been in the South, built on the backs of slaves. But the antebellum homes were not built because construction was cheap merely, but because that's where the biggest wealth in America was. Biggest wealth in my home state was from timber. It wasn't organized around the urban Portland. Urban Portland got money from the big timber centers around the state. Economic and social power built around the working farm, to then after the industrial age, economic and social power built around the working city. In between there, about 1900 to 1918, the Progressive Era, Woodrow Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, addressing gaping wealth disparities, addressing destruction of nature, addressing the subversion of democracy, coming out with the progressive platform. And to me, that is 100 years later, sort of where we were. We had forgotten some lessons of history. In the wake of the Civil War, the best and brightest weren't going to work in government. They were working in steel mills. They were building railroads. In the wake of the Vietnam War, the best and brightest, so many of them were going to Silicon Valley. And we're waking up in both eras, the Progressive Era and nowish, waking up from our orgasm of greed to look around at the challenges we have to address together. And that's where we're at. I promise we get to everybody. Raji, you've been waiting patiently. You got about 20 seconds, Raji.
Okay, I wanted to talk about using politics as a way to change before everything hits the you-know-what. And I understand that what the Thom Hartmann show does is amazing, and I listen to you guys all the time. But my question is, how are we going to get the American people to uprise by the millions as they do in other countries, which is what really causes change, because it's the only thing that causes the real people who are in power to be afraid and actually do something. I think politics is too slow, considering the amount of mess we've gotten ourselves into.
Depending on our definition of politics. If what we mean by politics is merely elections, I couldn't agree more. We have to focus on more than elections. We have to be movement builders. We have to be institution builders. We can't just rely on the stuff that's there and make choices betwixt it. We have to build new stuff, build new energy. And each of us, I do think, needs to take one step more than we used to take. We have to have habits that are a little bit more engaged in the public thing than they used to be. We have to keep in mind the Stockdale paradox. We have to be brutally honest with the critical facts that are facing us, and be ultimately confident that eventually democracy can win. You're the coalition of the benevolently irrational, the good people doing good things for no good reason. And with you, democracy is possible. You're priceless. Definition of priceless, worth a lot, not for sale. I'm Jefferson Smith. I'll be back tomorrow. Love to Thom Hartmann, love to you.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
We say fight back!